telling him to go. We understand that resignation statement is being prepared in number 10 as we speak, and we expect that the Prime Minister will deliver it today. What happens after that? The Prime Minister is expected by convention to stay on while the Conservative Party hold a leadership contest. So we would expect the Prime Minister to stay in post while Conservative MPs vote for candidates and then Conservative members choose a candidate. So potentially 2 or 3 months he will be in post. But we expect the Prime Minister now to announce his resignation today.
My government source is telling me within the last few moments, it's done, it's over, he's going.
And I think we very much expect that is what is going to happen. The Prime Minister has taken a long time to come to this realisation. Some deeply surreal scenes last night, Kay, when we heard that Michael Gove had been sacked from the Cabinet, and we saw a government minister on Sky News, Tim Lawton, saying when Michael Gove went to see him with the whiskey and the revolver, he drank the whiskey and turned the revolver on Michael Gove. When you see Conservatives saying these kind of things on television, you know that the end is nigh, and now it seems the Prime Minister has heard that message loud and clear, not least from his brand new Chancellor.
Our political editor, Beth Rigby, joining us now. Beth, a significant moment when the Chancellor says to the Prime Minister, go, he still doesn't go. He then makes what he said to him public, and the Prime Minister is going to go today, is what you understand.
Yeah, we understand that the Prime Minister will resign today. Look, I spoke to a Cabinet Minister this morning who had seen the Prime Minister, had a long conversation with him yesterday and said to the Prime Minister, the game is up. You simply do not have the numbers to fill posts in your government. The country will be ungovernable. You cannot carry on. He tried to hold on last night. You saw the reports on the news. But as we understand it this morning, let me just get the statement up from on my phone, that Boris Johnson, we understand, has spoken to the Tory party chair or committee chair, 22 chair, Graham Brady, and agreed to stand down. So we're going to expect a resignation from Boris Johnson later today. It's over for him. He tried until the very end to hold on. But when you're faced with over 50 government resignations, half a dozen of your cabinet walking out and finding yourself unable to fill even cabinet positions with ministers unwilling to be promoted, with parliamentarians unwilling to serve, that's when your government collapses. The game is up for Boris Johnson. He's going to have to stand down.
OK, Beth, so what happens now? Unprecedented times, the helicopters are already up, the street has gone absolutely bonkers. What happens now?
Well, what we will expect to happen now is the Prime Minister will be in there this morning. He will be with his advisers. He will be drafting a resignation statement, and we'll expect to hear from him later. That will then, of course, trigger a leadership race within the Conservative Party. And I think what is difficult about this one compared to the moment that Theresa May resigned in 2019 was back in 2019, there was a clear successor to Theresa May. It was Boris Johnson, and he went on to win that leadership race in a runoff against Jeremy Hunt. But this time, the field is wide open. Politicians are not ousting Boris Johnson because of a policy disagreement, as they did over May regarding Brexit, and they don't really have a plan of what comes next or who they would like to be leader. They are literally ousting him because they cannot serve under him, and it's just got too bad being in a Boris Johnson cabinet, government and even parliamentary party. And so what will happen now is he will resign, and then there will be a leadership contest, and in the coming days we will see all the runners and riders coming out to make their pitch to the parliamentary party. We've already had overnight Suella Braverman. She's the Attorney General, the most senior legal mind in government. She has announced overnight that she would like to run. We've got Rishi Sunak, we've got Sajid Javid, we've got Tom Tugendhat, the chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, who is perhaps the favoured choice of the One Nation group of Conservatives in the party. What about Brandon Lewis, the Northern Ireland Secretary that just resigned, Nadeem Zahawi, Penny Mordaunt? I have got such a long list of would-be runners and riders, and then we're going to have a competition to see who takes the job, but it comes at such a difficult time for the country, given the cost of living crisis and the difficulties that households up and down the land are having. And I've just got an official number 10 statement just out. The Prime Minister will make a statement to the country today. So Boris Johnson will make a statement today. It is over for him. He won the biggest majority, didn't he, back in 2019 of any Conservative Prime Minister since Margaret Thatcher. He was potentially a two-term Prime Minister, but after 2.5 years, his reign has come to an end, and Boris Johnson is standing down as Conservative Party leader and Prime Minister.
Well, it's a moment in history again, Beth, isn't it? You've witnessed so many for us already as our political editor. When do you think we will hear from him? When will he make that statement, and in what capacity? Do we know yet?
I don't know yet, Kay. What I do know is, as I've said, there is now an official statement saying that Boris Johnson will make a statement to the country later. And as I was saying earlier, he has spoken to Sir Graham Brady, who went to see him yesterday, the chair of the 22 Backbench Committee, and agreed to stand down as a party leader, so a new leader can be in place by party conference. So that is in October. At the end of September into October, a new party leader in place for the autumn. He will remain Prime Minister until that point. So I've just been told by a number 10 figure, the Prime Minister is now agreeing to an orderly handover of power. So instead of fighting on, he's now agreed to resign. He's told Graham Brady of his intentions, and he will remain Prime Minister over the summer while that leadership race is played out, and they hope to have a new Prime Minister and Conservative Party leader by the autumn. So the summer recess is going to be taken up by a lot of campaigning by would-be new Prime Ministers and Conservative Party leaders. It is such an incredible moment. We could see, really, as I was saying a couple of days ago, that his time was up when those resignations happened in Cabinet. That was perhaps the moment. And then the snowballing effect over the 12 hours following, when dozens of government resignations began to fall in, and Cabinet members then went, didn't they, yesterday in a delegation to tell Boris Johnson he had to go. But even last night, number 10 were briefing of his defiance, telling me that he was going to call Sir Graham Brady's bluff, that he was going to force a confidence vote in him. Well, overnight, and as dawn broke and more people resigned, Brandon Lewis standing down as Northern Ireland Secretary, and then Nadhim Zahawi telling the Prime Minister that he had to go. And then we had Michelle Donnellan, also the Education Secretary, the game up for Boris Johnson. However hard he fought, however much he wanted it, it was simply not tenable for him to continue.
But Beth, he's caused an awful lot of angst in the process, hasn't he? Everybody keeps, not everybody, several people keep telling me how dignified he is as Prime Minister. We haven't seen much dignity over the last 48 hours.
Look, he is a politician, as I said in my report last night, that defies political gravity. The conventions he believes doesn't apply to him. He thinks he can do things differently. And that spirit, in a way, is what drove him into Brexit and then drove him into that 2019 election, and did well for him. He won a huge majority. He was the most successful Conservative leader since Margaret Thatcher. But some of his flaws, his character flaws, his conduct, his own goals really, are the things that brought him down. And in the end, as hard as he may fight, if your government is collapsing, you cannot run a country. And if you cannot run a country, however much he might want it, he cannot remain as Prime Minister. And Kay, what might we expect later? Look, it's all very fluid, but normally what would happen is the Prime Minister would come out of the door at 10 Downing Street. You can see it on your screen there. The plinth comes out and they make a statement to the world's media and the country outside Downing Street, announcing that they intend to stand down. So now the race to replace Boris Johnson is on.
OK, so, Beth, Let me just recap, just for people who are just tuning our way. You can see on your screen, within the last few minutes, we've heard that Boris Johnson has agreed to an orderly transition after agreeing to step down as Conservative Party leader, ergo Prime Minister. He's going, and he is going today. Beth is with us, our political editor, of course. So, Beth, just run us through what's going to happen next for people just tuning our way here on The Breakfast Show.
OK, so what's happened in the past couple of hours is that there have been further cabinet resignations, and Boris Johnson has now agreed that he cannot continue as Prime Minister, that he will step down, that he will make a statement to the country today, and that he will remain as Prime Minister until there is a successor. And the Conservative Party hope to have a new party leader and a new Prime Minister by party conference at the beginning of October. What will happen now is the Prime Minister, as I was saying, will be inside number 10 with his top team, and he will be preparing the words that he wants to deliver to the country. I would imagine that he would like to take that moment to talk to people about his successes, about the referendum, winning that for the Brexiteers, and then about delivering Brexit against the odds, about his big electoral mandate. One of the reasons he was very reluctant to stand down and defiant was, from his perspective, he won a mandate from 14 million people across this country, and he believed that that mandate was bigger than those in his party who would want him gone. So I imagine he will talk about his success, and then I imagine that he will reflect on what has happened and then talk about the future and wish any successor well. But it will be such a hard statement for him to make. I was with him in Rwanda, in Kigali, on the CHOGM, the Commonwealth Heads of Government Summit, a couple of weeks ago, and in the huddles, in the briefings he gave to journalists, he was a politician that believed not only would he win the next election, but he could still potentially govern into the 2030s. He did not want to leave number 10, and actually what he will go down as in history instead is one of the shortest serving Conservative Prime Ministers there had been. He had it, didn't he, in his grasp to potentially serve for 2 terms, but it's over for him. So he will come out, I imagine, make a statement on the steps of number 10, and then the page turns and the focus will then be on all the runners and riders and who in the Conservative Party will replace him.
OK, I want to come to that in just a second, Beth, if I may. But what do you think it was that made him decide that, despite suggestions that people, I think I was reading the papers this morning, that anybody that wanted to get rid of him would have to bathe their hands in blood in some Shakespearean way before he could be dragged away from number 10. But 2 of the people that went to see him last night, Brandon Lewis, or certainly he was a signatory to trying to get rid of him last night, although he was trapped in Northern Ireland in Belfast because his flight was delayed. And then also the Chancellor, both of them this morning have said the game is up.
Okay, I think it's very simple what happened, which was there was a Prime Minister going to bed last night, if he even slept, saying that he was going to hang on and stand in and carry on. But the numbers are simply not there. He had no other option. He can't run a government or the country if he cannot fill cabinet vacancies, if he cannot get other backbenchers to step up and to serve. And what will have happened is those closest to him would have tapped him on the shoulder and said, Boris Johnson, as much as you may want to carry on, you simply can't. And as I understand it, the cabinet ministers that had conversations with him yesterday, that was exactly what they were telling him. Now, he didn't want to hear that. In fact, he sacked Michael Gove because Michael Gove was threatening to resign. But when Brandon Lewis sent that letter in this morning, when the Chancellor that he has just appointed then publicly tells him to go, he literally doesn't have a cabinet. And this is not a presidential situation. This is a parliamentary democracy run by cabinet collective responsibility. It's a parliamentary democracy where you need the support of your cabinet and you need the support of enough of your parliamentary party to remain as Prime Minister. And that, whether he likes it or not, is the mandate that they can take away from him. And he's obviously realised today that even if he wants to carry on, which I am sure he does, he simply cannot. So he's standing down. And actually, what's interesting about what's emerging this morning is there was some talk yesterday about him fighting to the death, about there being chaos if he stands down. But he's now saying that he will stay on as a caretaker Prime Minister until his successor's appointed.
Beth, I know you need to go and talk to an awful lot of people. You'll be with us. You've got a very busy day ahead of you. Thanks so much indeed for breaking that news with us here on The Breakfast Show on Sky this morning. Thank you. OK, so here we go. Wherever you're watching us around the world, you're joining The Breakfast Show here on Sky News. To the news that Boris Johnson has agreed to resign. The Prime Minister will step down. He will make a statement to the country today. He will remain as Prime Minister until there is a successor, and the Conservative Party hope to have a new PM and a new party leader by the beginning of their party conference in October. So, yes, it doesn't just happen straight away. He'll remain in post for now as a caretaker Prime Minister, if you will. Boris Johnson currently in Downing Street preparing that resignation speech. It comes after 57 MPs resigned in the last 2 days. His Chancellor, who he only appointed 36 hours ago this morning, telling him to go and go now. It does appear that that was the tipping point for the Prime Minister. He had nowhere else to hide. 5 other cabinet ministers also stepping down as well. So this is playing out in real time. The Prime Minister said that he would have to be dragged out of there with people with their hands covered in blood in some theatrical Shakespearean manner. That's not happening. Later on today, the podium will come out of number 10 Downing Street. The Prime Minister will stand behind it. No doubt he'll tell us about some of his achievements, as Beth Rigby was saying, but however way you coat it, he is going. He is leaving the role as Prime Minister. Tamara Cohen.
Okay, we are witnessing a moment of history. Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister who won this historic majority 2.5 years ago, is now being forced to resign because of an exodus of his own ministers, including in the cabinet. He, yesterday, was determined to brazen it out, to carry on somehow or other. It has now been made abundantly clear to him, even by his closest supporters, that the party will not accept him staying on, and that many MPs are doing this because they believe their voters do not want him to stay on. So Boris Johnson, the most electorally successful leader since Margaret Thatcher in 1987, is now on his way out. In the Conservative Party, is now on his way out, and that will be happening. It's been confirmed today. He is in there right now, writing his resignation statement, and we will no doubt see at some point in the coming hours a lectern coming out and Boris Johnson delivering his final thoughts on what he's achieved. I'm sure we'll hear about getting Brexit done, about levelling up, and what he has left. What is left for his successor. He will remain as Prime Minister until October while a leadership contest plays out, and the beauty contest will no doubt start pretty soon. But his time in office is coming to an end, and his supporters will see this as something of a Greek tragedy, really, that someone with so much potential, with that huge majority to do whatever he wanted, is now seeing his time in office end in what can only be described as a rather humiliating fashion of unprecedented resignations, forcing him to the exit door.
I wish I could show with you what's happening here at the moment. Film crews coming all the time, piling in all the time from right around the world, because it is a momentous moment. The Prime Minister is about to come out, well, we're not quite sure when, but sometime within the next couple of hours or so, will be coming out of that door and telling us that finally the game is up. What was it that did for him?
What did for him was the fact that even his closest allies in cabinet told him he could not carry on. They would not carry on with him in post. We've seen all these resignations. It began Tuesday night with Sajid Javid and Rishi Sunak resigning within 10 minutes of each other. It's continued yesterday with the junior ranks leaving their posts, and then today the Northern Ireland Secretary, the Welsh Secretary, and then those who have to stay in their posts, like Priti Patel and Ben Wallace.
Why do they?
Because for national security reasons, you cannot leave the person in charge of our security services, the person in charge of our armed forces. They cannot leave their positions unmanned. They've both made clear, Ben Wallace personally, Priti Patel, through allies I've spoken to, that they would do if they could. But the messages to the Prime Minister, we have to stay in post, but you no longer can continue. And of course, the final blow came from this brand new Chancellor, Nadhim Zahawi, who had appeared 24 hours ago, thought the Prime Minister could turn this around. He has now said publicly that Boris Johnson cannot turn this around and must go. So an exodus of his senior ministers. I mean, yesterday we knew that some of them were in here telling him it was over. Michael Gove got sacked for doing that. So when we talk about how this is ending compared to previous prime ministers, Margaret Thatcher had what's been described as the men in grey suits coming to tell her the game was up. Theresa May had Graham Brady tell her the game was up. Boris Johnson had men and women coming to tell him it was over, but he clung on, and it is only now, when all the resignations have reached such a pitch that is really not possible for him to carry on governing the country. We now know that he believes his time in office is over.
Well, Walden's with us. He was the former press secretary to Boris Johnson, has worked with him very closely for a number of years. Hi, good morning. Were you expecting this morning?
Hello, Kay. I've said to you on many occasions in recent months, and I wrote in the Times overnight, that Boris doesn't do change, he doesn't do apology, and he pretty much doesn't do resignation unless it benefits him. And I was getting very worried this morning that he was actually not only trashing his legacy, but trashing the very tenets of democracy. So all I can say to you this morning, Kay, is thank God. You know, he has finally done the right thing. But what a farce. To be dragged kicking and screaming like he is an embarrassment. And what I hope now, I mean, here's the situation, right? Is he going to reappoint the 57 ministers and trade envoys and PPSs as he goes on for the next? This is all totally unnecessary. The writing was on the wall, and I presume he is going to have to reappoint people to cabinet and not give new jobs to people, and that would be the right thing to do. And I do hope when we see the Prime Minister later that instead of the usual guff, because that's what it's become. I'm sorry to say, you know, as an old friend, he knows my views on it all. It has become that. Let's not have all the usual pandering, Boris. Let's have a serious, sober statement that the right conclusion has been reached, that he can salvage some of the legacy around Brexit and around Ukraine and around COVID vaccine. Yes, let's give him that, right? But let's also have an orderly transition. And that means making sure that we don't have useless, pointless legislation on the agenda, that they only concentrate on the things that really matter, the stuff like solving the current cost of living crisis, and that we have a sober handover. What we saw last night was beyond farce, you know, dipping hands in blood, the revenge stuff on Michael Gove, pathetic. Absolutely pathetic, I'm sorry to say. And he has now finally seen that the writing is not on the wall. But it has taken the resignation of his education secretary, who must be the shortest serving cabinet minister in history, and his new chancellor telling him the game is up. And I think he's come dangerously close to reaching a point where he would trash his entire legacy. He has an opportunity today, now having resigned, to do the right thing in terms of this speech and the right thing over the next 6 to 12 weeks. And I hope he takes that opportunity, and I hope he does it properly, because that is what will define him going forward.
OK, and as far as what's going on behind us in number 10 at the moment, two questions. What will be happening? Who'll be surrounding him? And how will he be feeling?
Well, I suspect he'll be feeling utterly miserable. But it's self-inflicted. From the very beginning, this has been self-inflicted. He's made missteps all along in the handling of these incidents, and ultimately it has cost him. And the talk yesterday of, I carry on, I have a mandate, you know, he doesn't have a mandate. He certainly doesn't have a mandate now, but he doesn't anyway. He's lost. And Beth made a little accidental misstep earlier where she referred to two-term president and then corrected himself. And that's the problem. I think Boris has seen this as a presidency. He has taken his example from the mayoralty with no opposition and come into number 10 with the same presidential plan. And that has cost him. So what will be going on now is that there'll be presumably, I mean, it could be that, he'll feel very disappointed, but actually prime ministers, when they make the decision, there's a huge weight immediately comes off their shoulders. And it could be that they're all sitting around, probably watching us, throwing things at me, just saying, oh, well, it was great, and talking about their greatest hits. I hope that they're somberly and soberly preparing for the next 12 weeks, writing a decent, principled resignation speech. And he should be given credit for, for a lot of stuff that's happened. But if you're going to be prime minister, it's a massively difficult job, and you've got to get much of it right. And when you get it wrong, you've got to be brave enough to front up and say that. And I hope that he does some of that today. And I hope that, that when we hear the speech and when we hear the plan for the next 12 weeks, we have a somber assessment of the grave problems that face this country, the grave problems that face Europe and the world with everything that's going on in Ukraine and the like, and that we have 12 weeks of calm where the Prime Minister can salvage some of this legacy, and we can have an orderly transition to a new Prime Minister and a new government.
Is that within him? Can he do that?
Yes, it absolutely is.
Can he behave himself?
Yes, he can. It sounds like he's still kicking and screaming and didn't want to go, but they've persuaded him that, and I'm glad they have, and I hope that people like Gito Hari and David Canzini are close to him, have stood up to him this morning and said, I hope that's what's happened, that it's over, and they now help him through this next period. And he is absolutely capable of that. I've said to you many times, Kay, he is not a bad man, right? But it has unravelled and it is over, and he needs to think soberly about the country and, yes, about his legacy. And actually his legacy will be vastly improved if he deals with the next 6 to 12 weeks correctly. It is the next test in Boris Johnson's extraordinary career, and I hope he reflects on that in the next few hours and does the right thing.
How do you think he'll be remembered?
Well, I think if he was still here next Tuesday and hadn't done what he'd done this morning and they booted him out, I think he'd be remembered for only this, frankly. I think he's just about been able to pull it back. And I think the interesting thing is, if he was booted out next week as opposed to now and going as he has, I suspect they wouldn't have allowed him to continue as Prime Minister. We would have had an interim Prime Minister, and that would have been an extraordinary event. So I think he will be remembered as a great communicator. The man that absolutely delivered Brexit and got Brexit done. I think history tends to judge prime ministers better, with the benefit of hindsight. And he's done the right things around Ukraine. But I think it will also remember somebody that fundamentally didn't listen. And that became somewhat presidential. And I think that's the reason that he's in the pickle and has had to resign. There's great things ahead, I'm sure, for Boris Johnson. He has great things to offer. I just hope that he can offer them in a sober, sensible and pragmatic way. And look, he's the greatest campaigner of his generation. And he'll always be able to say, my party got a 80-seat majority and a massive mandate. Unfortunately, I suspect that not much of that will be remembered now because of the events of the last week.
Will Walden, it's always fascinating to talk to you. Thanks very much indeed.
Thanks,
Will
Kate.
Walden there, very close to the Prime Minister, former press secretary, giving us an insight into the mind of the man who will be stepping down as Prime Minister later on today. We've heard from the man who would be Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, leader of the Labour Party, of course. He said, it is good news for the country that Boris Johnson has resigned as Prime Minister, but it should have happened long ago. He will always be unfit for office. He has been responsible for lies, scandal and fraud on an industrial scale. And all those who have been complicit should be utterly ashamed. The Tory party have inflicted chaos upon the country during the worst case of living crisis in decades, and they cannot now pretend they are the ones to sort it out. They have been in power for 12 years. The damage they have done is profound. 12 years of economic stagnation, he says. 12 years of declining public services. 12 years of empty promises. Enough is enough. We don't need to change the Tory at the top. We need a proper change of government. We need a fresh start for Britain. My old buddy and Sky News commentator Adam and contributor Adam Bolton is with us now. Hey, Adam.
Hello, Kay. I wouldn't want to miss a day like this without speaking to you.
We've done quite a few of these. Where does this rank?
I think this is the most spectacular ever. I think comparatively, the departures from office of Mrs. Thatcher or Tony Blair or Theresa May were relatively orderly. The difference this time is that the incumbent, the Prime Minister Boris Johnson, has been trying with all his might to resist the due process of what happens to a Prime Minister when their own party can no longer report them. And we've had the frankly Trumpian claims repeatedly from Mr. Johnson and his camp that he somehow has a personal mandate of 14 million votes to stay in office. And I think we should be in no doubt that this has been messy. Mr. Johnson hasn't been sitting in Downing Street planning a graceful exit. He's been fighting tooth and nail to stay in. And now he's simply been overwhelmed by the resignations of ministers and also the mood of his own party. Clear, I think, that had he fought it as he was intending to a second vote of confidence next week, he would have lost it. So he's going now. And I think because of that, Kay, I wouldn't be as certain as Will Walden that we're going to see a kind of 12-week sort of shadow prime ministership where Boris Johnson is going to do a victory tour. There's a lot of voices within the Conservative Party saying much better that he should go now and that Dominic Raab, the Deputy Prime Minister, should be the stand-in for the transition, simply because Boris Johnson has created so much chaos, brought British politics and the Conservative Party and the government into so much ill repute that there is not a mood that I'm picking up from senior Conservatives to allow him a kind of victory lap at the end of his premiership. And that is quite significant because if he were to go now, he would have served for less time than Theresa May, who he was her nemesis, of course, because they're about 28 days longer that she had in office as of today. Whereas if he is allowed a caretaker premiership up until October, he will overtake Theresa May. So I suspect one of the reasons why we're not hearing a clear message as yet from Boris Johnson is because that fight is still going on within the Conservative Party, and there aren't clear rules on that.
Is it within his remit? Can he say, you know what, I'm going to stay? Or can they say, no, you're not, you're going now?
I think he can certainly try and stay, but I think constitutionally it is within the power of the Conservative Party and the Conservative MPs to simply remove him as leader. So, it's another mess, frankly, which we're seeing, but certainly we're seeing journalists who, from the Spectator crowd, who are close to Boris Johnson and his camp tweeting that there is considerable argument going on at the top. I mean, of course, one of the effects, I think, if Dominic Raab were to step in as caretaker while a new Tory leader is chosen, is that he himself would probably pretty much have to rule out of running for the leadership. And we don't know what his intentions are, but he may not want to give that up.
It's often said that he who or she, the person that wields the knife, the sword, does not wear the crown. And people use that as an example to point to Rishi Sunak, who was one of the first to go, him and, of course, Sajid Javid as well. But that's not always the case, is it? I mean, we've been talking recently, Adam, have we not, about people like Gordon Brown, who did that to Tony Blair. And there are many other examples within the Conservative Party as well, where those that have wielded the knife have still won the crown. Yeah,
well, Boris Johnson, of course, wielded the knife against Theresa May, and he ended up, as we all know, Prime Minister. But I think the point in this case, Kay, if I can use another analogy, is that this has turned into Murder on the Orient Express because of Boris Johnson's resistance. Everybody now does have their hands dipped in blood. I mean, even people like Priti Patel, Suella Braverman, Nadhim Zahawi, people who continue to work under Boris Johnson have all said that he should go. So I don't think it would be possible to pick out the former Chancellor as the person who wielded the knife. I mean, in a certain sense, if anybody wielded the knife, there are two people. One is Chris Pincher, because of his alleged appalling behaviour and sexual harassment at a time when he must have known that the Prime Minister was extremely vulnerable to any allegations of impropriety. And secondly, we shouldn't forget Sir Simon MacDonald, who basically produced chapter and verse showing that Boris Johnson was lying and sending other ministers out to lie on his behalf over what he knew about Pincher. Those are the two things that have happened this week that have forced him out compared to the vote of confidence on June the 6th.
Just seeing a tweet from Ed Davey, Adam. Sir Ed Davey, I should say, leader of the Liberal Democrats, saying the idea that the Conservatives might make Boris Johnson caretaker for anything is frankly ludicrous, is what he says. The man's never taken care of anything in his life. So there will be some resistance for him to be the caretaker over the summer.
Yes, I think there will be. And frankly, there's also going to be reputational management for the Conservative Party. That do they want to inflict Boris Johnson after his behaviour on the nation for a further 3 months? I suspect they don't, because they look at the opinion polls. They can see that they're behind Labour. And to have Boris Johnson with any levers within reach after his behaviour will be something that will concern the Conservative Party and will also probably concern the government and the civil service. I mean, I think what we are going to see in this process, whoever emerges as Conservative Party leader, is a pretty mass clear-out of those people who have been acolytes of Boris Johnson in the government, quite possibly going as far as Simon Case, the Cabinet Secretary on the one hand, and very prominent members of the present Cabinet. I think most of them like Boris Johnson, they will find that time will be up under the new leader.
If not him, and it's definitely not going to be him, because we're expecting a resignation speech from him today, maybe as early as this morning. We'll have to wait and see. Our political editor, Beth Rigby, will be updating us on that in just a moment. Then whom, do you think?
Well, the fascinating thing about this, and I've been saying and writing about this for a while, is that Conservative leadership contests tend to be sparked about getting rid of someone when the party doesn't necessarily know who's going to emerge at the end of now an election process. And I can think of perhaps a dozen MPs who could end up leading the party as prime ministers. I mean, remember, no one saw John Major coming when Mrs Thatcher was forced out. No one particularly saw that Ian Duncan Smith was going to emerge as leader of the Conservative Party and leader of the opposition. And so, you know, one looks at the favourites, and obviously one can see people like the former Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, for example. One can see ambitious members of the present government like Liz Truss. I mean, you can see the bookies odds, but you can look at people who perhaps people aren't talking about. I mean, Priti Patel, for example, she was close to Boris Johnson, but turned against him, we understand. Suella Braverman, similar position. She's now putting herself forward. A lot of people have been talking to me about Penny Mordaunt, who had an impressive stint as Defence Secretary, but was then demoted by Boris Johnson because she wasn't one of his personal supporters. So, I mean, I'm not saying any of them are going to do it, but I'm saying the way this process works, with MPs whittling down a shortlist of 2, and then the party membership in the country taking place in a ballot to choose one of those 2, it is very, very difficult to predict who will emerge at the end of it. And I think the bitterness and rancour that we've seen this week and the stances which individual politicians have taken towards getting rid of Boris Johnson will definitely colour how people choose to vote. I mean, it's interesting, for example, that we've heard this morning that Steve Baker, the leader of the ERG, says that he's getting a lot of requests to stand. And it has to be said that as a right-winger, someone who was a strong supporter of Brexit, he was one of the very early people to say that Boris Johnson's behaviour as Prime Minister was unacceptable and he should go. Now, that may count in his favour, but correspondingly, it may count against him with some people who feel sore about the departure of Boris Johnson.
Adam, coming thick and fast now on Twitter, the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, there will be a widespread sense of relief that the chaos of the last few days, indeed months, will come to an end, though the notion of Boris Johnson staying on as PM until the autumn seems far from ideal and surely not sustainable. So even if the party feel that they can keep him on as Prime Minister during the summer, they're now lining up from the opposition parties to say, absolutely not. Controversy even when he said he's going.
Exactly, and as ever, a mess. We don't have a clear sign from the Prime Minister. We understand we've been told he's going, but we're not being told how he sees his departure going. And I suspect that's because argument is going on at this very moment in those behind the door behind you as to precisely the nature of his departure. I mean, there's that famous quote from Macbeth, nothing so became him in his life as the leaving of it. And this is a political life we're seeing the end of. I don't think we've heard the last of Boris Johnson. But the fact that it's a mess, bitter and rancorous and all about Boris Johnson is entirely characteristic of the political life of this man so far.
OK, Adam, we're just looking at Nicola Sturgeon there as her tweet. And joining me now is our political editor, Beth Rigby. Beth, where you go, flipping heck.
Yeah, look, this was sort of the beginning of the end, really, on Tuesday night when Sajid Javid and Rishi Sunak resigned. But the Cabinet then shored Boris Johnson up. But then what happened, as you saw, was over the following few hours, there was an avalanche of resignations to the point that the Prime Minister's still trying to hang in there. On last night, he had no option this morning but to resign. Brandon Lewis going. He was unable to fill cabinet positions. And what's clearly happened is the people around him have said, Boris Johnson, it's time to go. So after 2.5 years, soon he will be coming out here to make a statement to the country about resigning. Don't know, sometime maybe this morning, don't know yet.
OK. It comes to something when the Chancellor tells you in private to go, you still stay, and then he makes the view public.
I think, is that James Dudridge? I think, yes, James Dudridge, has the Prime Minister done the right thing, sir?
Good morning, sir.
Are you sorry to see him go, sir?
Of the United
Are you sorry to see him go, sir? So, OK, that's James Dudridge. He is the Prime Minister's ministerial aide. So he's the guy that goes into the Commons and he talks to all of the MPs. And he was the one that spoke to our John Craig last night, doing a public statement saying there was going to be a speech on the economy and the mood was buoyant in Number 10 and the Prime Minister was going to go on. So he's obviously gone in there now to talk to his boss, to talk to him about that resignation statement. But where were we? So we expect him to come out now. But you're right, there's already some controversy around Boris Johnson's statement this morning, or statement rather from Number 10, saying that he intends to stay on until a new Conservative Party leader is elected by party conference at the beginning of October. George Freeman, a minister who resigned this morning, has just said the PM's now finally done the decent thing and he needs to hand in the seals to the office. And he also says he needs to appoint a caretaker under whom ministers can serve. So his view is that there should be a caretaker Prime Minister. I've just checked that out with a cabinet minister who is of the view that the Prime Minister should be able to stay until a successor is found, is elected or chosen rather by the Conservative Party, by the membership. So I'm just getting this through as well. This is from my colleague Sam Coates. He understands, as we were talking about, there is some cabinet concern about any attempt by Boris Johnson, if he tries to stay as late as October, One option they think is more acceptable, this is from Sam, could be to get the last two in the summer, handover in September, or Dominic Raab takes over, the Deputy Prime Minister, as a caretaker. But as I said, another Cabinet Minister...
He has stepped in for him several times,
He has.
Not least, he had a minor operation, didn't he, just a couple of weeks ago, the Prime Minister?
Yeah, but I mean, this
is
another Cabinet Minister. To me, I said, are you happy for him to stay on as a caretaker Prime Minister? And he says only as Theresa May did, he holds the reins until a new leader is chosen. But that isn't kind of the moment, is it now? What we're waiting for now is Boris Johnson to come out and make that statement. He thought that he would be a Prime Minister that would serve 1, 2, perhaps even 3 terms. He was joking when we were in Kigali at Chogam but 2 weeks ago about the prospect of being Prime Minister into the 2030s, but the mood of the party and now his cabinet was you have to go.
OK, our political editor, Beth Rigby, with me here in Downing Street. If you are just tuning our way, you are watching Sky News, and as you can see on the bottom of your screen there, it is pretty blockbusting breaking news for you here on Sky this morning. The Breakfast Show, you're very, very welcome to join us. It is 10 o'clock. Welcome to Downing Street. We start with that breaking news that the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, is to resign today and will make a statement right here in just a short while. He's expected to remain as Prime Minister until there is a successor, and the Conservative Party hope to have a new PM and a new party leader by the start of party conference. When's that? Well, it's in October. Can you believe it? It comes after 57 MPs resigned in the last 48 hours. His Chancellor, who he appointed only 36 hours ago, telling him it's time to go and go now. Beth is with us. So that was the straw that broke the camel's back, I suppose. The Chancellor saying it's over.
I spoke to a Cabinet Minister that saw the Prime Minister yesterday, who told me this morning I was coming in into Downing Street, that it was made very clear to him last night by a number of Cabinet Ministers that they held no personal animosity to him. They didn't want to resign, but he simply did not have the numbers to fill the government positions. I did a report at 9:30 last night, 38 resignations. By this morning, it was 52.
No, it's 59. You
59,
on the screen,
I can't keep up.
Exactly.
So 59 resignations. He hasn't got enough people in the parliamentary party willing to serve. And when you get to that point as a Prime Minister, you can't fill your cabinet positions, you can't fill ministerial posts, you can't govern the country, you can't run a government, you cannot carry on. And I think really there was a last throw of the die, a last gasp to try and hang on, to cling on last night. But the resignation, I think, of Brandon Lewis, Simon Hart, the Welsh Secretary, resigning at 11 o'clock last night, Suella Braverman, the Attorney General, coming out late last night, calling on him to go, and then Brandon Lewis' letter this morning. I mean, the writing was on the wall. It was interesting, even Priti Patel, who is one of the Prime Minister's most loyal supporters and campaigned for him as Mayor of London. She helped lead his leadership campaign. She got the Brexiteers to align behind him. So she was so key to him. Even she went in yesterday and said to him, you do not command the support of the parliamentary party. It's time to go. The last person that was willing to hear it clearly was him. But this morning he's woken up. He's actually got no other choice.
We saw the Chief Whip actually go in just after 7 o'clock, and Tamara Cohn, who was with me this morning, recognised then there was something afoot. He must have made his mind up overnight, or it was made up for him.
Well, I think what happened overnight was he was trying to get Cabinet Ministers not to resign. He was offering them lots of other jobs. Someone told me that Brandon Lewis, for example, was offered a series of different positions which he didn't want to take. And the Chief Whip will have gone in there this morning. And I imagine the discussion this morning was, you can't fill your government positions, you're going to have to resign.
May I share with you what Sadiq Khan is saying?
Yes.
He's the Mayor of London, the Prime Minister, previously Mayor of London, of course. He says this has been one of the most shameful sagas in the history of British politics. Boris Johnson has presided over a government defined by lies, sleaze, an utter lack of integrity, unlawful behaviour, incompetence, and a damaging culture of impunity in public office. We've also heard from the First Minister, we've also heard from others as well, who are all saying that good that he's going, but he shouldn't be allowed to stay in office until October. What do you think?
Well, look, I'm sort of checking that out with other people. Another former cabinet minister has just said to me, him being a caretaker is okay. He can show respect for constitutional norms. So I think there's quite a division there.
Sure.
They do need
What do you predict?
They do need a caretaker prime minister. I think the story now will move very quickly to who will replace him. They need a caretaker government over recess into September when they will elect a new party leader.
I've got so many questions for you. I'm going to go.
But I can't imagine at the moment. There is obviously some concern, and opposition leaders, of course, will say get out now because they would like to create as much chaos, if you like. It's been pretty chaotic actually the past few weeks, but they'll want to create as much chaos and disruption now as possible. But, you know, my cabinet sources are saying to me this morning anyway that they think it's OK if he stays on and just holds the fort.
Let me ask you something else, if I may. To get the new Prime Minister in post, first of all, it's up to the Tory MPs. They would whittle it down to 2,
Yes.
and then it goes to the country.
Yes.
It could
Well, it goes
be
to the
Tory
party members.
There we go. Thank you. And then after that. Before that, I'm getting all over the place. Before that, there could be 8, 10 of them that want to be Prime Minister. That has to be whittled down. They have to do that between now and the end of July. Otherwise, it's not until the autumn, because at the end of July, that's when they rise for the summer, that the House doesn't sit during the summer.
And this
Can they do it in that time?
So these are all questions that we're going to have to try and find out answer today. Look, as you said, what happens now is that the contenders make their pitch, and then they have a process where they launch their leadership bids, and then, as you said, there are a number of rounds of voting from the parliamentary party, not the public, and the parliamentary party whittle it down to 2 contenders. Last time it was Jeremy Hunt and Boris Johnson, and then they go around the country and try, with a series of hustings, to try and convince Conservative Party members to vote for them, and then it's whoever gets the most votes wins. But as you said, now typically the rounds of Tory Party MPs voting, that can take a few weeks sometimes. It can take 2, 3, 4. So they've also got to launch all their leadership bids, right? So we've got
I'm sure some of them are already working on those.
What I mean is we've got all the press conferences and the big moments of a number of people launching their leadership bids. Then they have to be whittled down, and then they go to the country. So I can see that this process might have to run. Well, it will have to run over recess. But you're right, in terms of MPs voting, it'd be difficult, I think. I don't know how are they going to make that happen before recess, which is meant to start on July, I think it's the 21st.
Okay.
So
Yes,
that is 2.5
Monday.
weeks from now. So it might be that Conservative MPs are voting on this over the summer. But look, Kay, the other thing is these things are unpredictable. Do you remember when David Cameron resigned back in 2016?
I do.
Boris Johnson, remember, Boris Johnson was meant to be in the race. Michael Gove then stabbed Boris Johnson in the front. They both pulled out of the race.
Yeah.
And then there was this sort of curious situation of a runoff potentially between Andrea Leadsom and Theresa May. Andrea Leadsom then just withdrew, and then Theresa May...
There was a reason for that, though, wasn't there?
Yeah, but Theresa May... Oh, we've got a little... What is that?
It's a bullfinch, I think.
What is it?
I think it's a bullfinch.
I got sorry, completely distracted. So basically, do you remember Theresa May? Then she just got the job, so there wasn't a long process, and it happened very quickly. I think this time, what's interesting is that the field is wide open. There isn't a plan B. It's not that the parliamentary party have ousted Boris Johnson because they want to put another into his position or change policy, as it was with Boris Johnson when he replaced Theresa May. They don't have a plan B. They just don't want him. And that means it's a very wide open race. There will be a number of people that want to replace him.
There's some of them for me.
Well, I mean, there's so many. There's Rishi Sunak. There's Sajid Javid, clearly. Brandon Lewis might want to go. Tom Tugendhat, who's the chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, he'll fancy it. Penny Mordaunt, she is a Brexiteer. She might want to do it. Who else have we got? I'm definitely missing
Nadeem
people off
Zahawi?
here. Nadeem Zahawi.
Penny Mordaunt?
Penny Mordaunt. Penny
Suella,
Mordaunt might
what's
be
her name?
the Brexiteers. Jeremy Hunt, will he have another go at it? There's a number of them. Suella Braverman has already said she would like to. Within Cabinet, Dominic Raab might want to go at the top job.
He said no to me, actually,
Did he?
on the telly.
OK, that's interesting. So he ran last time, so he's ruled himself. There's Liz Truss, who's not in the country, actually. She's on a foreign secretary trip abroad.
Steve Baker was almost
Steve Baker. Well, Steve Baker says that he's been approached, hasn't he? So he might have a go at it. So, you know, we've already got how many? 8, 9 names.
Yeah.
Now, what will happen is you have to get a number of MPs to support and then second you. And then you have to have enough MPs to kind of make it a serious bid. So what will happen is there will be some that would like to that will have to drop out quite quickly. And then you'll quickly get into a situation where you have 5, 6 serious contenders and then they get whittled down. But they'll be on television doing hustings and all sorts. It's going to be really busy at a time when Parliament is meant to be in recess.
Where are you going to put your 50p? Who's going to be the next Prime Minister?
I'm not putting my 50p on. But I can tell you, because I did look last night, that in terms of the bookies, because I trust them to make bets, it actually, Rishi is actually, I think he was 13-2. But Sajid Javid also, I think last night was 1 or 7-1. So, you know, interesting that the two guys that went first are the front runners. But it honestly is wide open. And you know, Rishi Sunak, but a few weeks ago was seen as a busted flush because the controversy around his wife's non-dom status and the fact that he'd kept that green card, it felt like Rishi was over. But I think that Rishi Sunak probably still is a serious proposition, although many in the Conservative Party don't really like his position on the economy. Of course, they want more tax cuts. But Rishi Sunak has to be a
Brexit's really
serious
important
option.
still, though, as well, isn't it, for the party? You know,
Yes.
they wanted to get Brexit done.
Yes.
And if you are a Remainer, I mean, that's what did for Jeremy Hunt, potentially.
Yeah, it was what did for Jeremy Hunt. I mean, really, Boris Johnson was nailed on in that race. I mean, Jeremy Hunt fought a good fight, but it really was...
He won by 66% of the vote,
yeah,
I think.
it was really nailed on. Sorry, there's another just break in here. Bim Afalami also agrees that Boris Johnson should stand down as leader.
So he was the vice chair of the party, resigned live on air earlier on in the week.
So he agrees that he doesn't want the Prime Minister to be a caretaker.
Even when he resigns, he's surrounded by scandal.
Prime Minister.
I was just about to go to Sam Coates. I'm just being told he's not there. So what I'm going to do instead, Beth, is ask you what will happen in the meantime to all of those positions that have been vacated, because government can't run at the moment. Will they just come back again?
I don't know.
Or will they say
That's
we're only going to come back if Boris Johnson is not in
That's a good question.
office?
It might be that some of those cabinet ministers that have resigned go back into post for the time being, because now really the game is over in terms of whether or not Boris Johnson can carry on. So it might be that some of those cabinet ministers decide to go back into post, and we'll ask them today and see what they say. But you know, how many resignations have we had? We've had the party chair, Oliver Dowden went, then we had Sajid Javid, then we had Rishi Sunak, then we had Simon Hart, Brandon Lewis, and Michael Gove was sacked. So that's five. I mean, Oliver Dowden was a couple of weeks ago. That's 5 vacant positions in cabinet. They need fill-in. They're massive jobs. The country needs to be run still. But I think the party, now they've closed the chapter on this controversy over Boris Johnson and whether or not he can remain Prime Minister, I think they need to get on now with trying to put people back into post and get on with governing.
Is this hay fever getting to you
Yeah,
like
I've got
it is
something
to
in my
me? That's
throat.
why
I
I'm
need
drinking
a
my
little
tea.
drink.
Have a quick drink of your tea. Joining us in just a second will be the Justice Minister, former Justice Minister, now Conservative MP only. That's Mr. Cartledge. Is he with us now? He is with us now. Let's bring him in, should we? Hello to you. Thanks for joining us on the programme this morning, Mr. Cartledge. Let me start by what I finished off there with Beth, and that is, would you be content to go back into your job if Boris Johnson stayed as interim Prime Minister over the summer?
Well, when you've only just resigned, that seems quite an extraordinary question to consider, as you can appreciate. I don't even know what the constitutional propriety is. As far as I'm concerned, I resigned this morning, and I just have relief that eventually the Prime Minister realised the game was up and has now done the right thing, and hopefully we can now move on.
yeah, it might be difficult to contemplate, but unless people like you and others who have resigned, the present tally is 59, do go back to help run the country, then we're in a very difficult position. My question to you is, would you be prepared to do that while Boris Johnson was still in number 10?
I mean, to be honest, I'd have to wait and wait and be called, as it were. And if someone were to ask me, I'd obviously consider at the time. It seems to me that I can't sit here speculating whether that's going to happen. The immediate priority I think we've achieved, which is that, given his position was untenable, the Prime Minister's resigned. Obviously, there's going to be a frenetic amount of activity, and next week we'll be moving into leadership election mode.
It's not speculation, though. It's what we're being told is going to happen. The Prime Minister has agreed, we're being told, to stay in post until a new leader is found. Will you?
No, understood. But obviously, in terms of what he does, what happens in terms of ministerial vacancies, I mean, that would then remain constitutionally a question for him.
Yeah, but he doesn't have enough people to fill the roles, does he?
I may be wrong, but I think you have to have a Solicitor General, for example. I mean, clearly you have to have a Chancellor of the Exchequer, one assumes. But I mean, if he is staying in the role of Prime Minister, presumably that will be his immediate task. Obviously, it feels odd to speculate on this when you've just resigned, but were one to get the call, then you'd have to obviously think about it. But you can appreciate it's a big deal to resign, and when you do so, you don't normally do it expecting that you might be back in like a sort of boomerang.
Yeah, I don't know if you've seen what the Leader of the Opposition has been saying this morning. He says it's a good job he's finally gone, but a plague on all your houses for keeping him in for so long.
Well, I'm speaking obviously personally. Actually, when you have a ministerial post, you have a responsibility with that. And as you know, I was the Courts Minister, and we do have a very challenging situation in the Crown Court. So I felt duty-bound to stay in my post. But when I woke up this morning, it was pretty obvious that the situation was totally untenable. I felt I had no choice but to resign, and now clearly, with so many of us having done so, the Prime Minister's realised the reality of the position, and hopefully we can move on.
OK, just to explain to people, 10:15 this time means that's when we're testing the fire alarm at Millbank, where you are this morning. So there's nothing to worry about for people who are watching.
I've lost sound, and there's a fire alarm.
OK, he's lost sound with us. If someone can sort that out for me, please. Lucy, tell me again. Lucy, tell me again who has resigned. Rebecca Power, Environment Minister, has now also stepped down, is what we're hearing. That's bringing the government resignations in the last 48 hours to 60. Sam Coates is joining us now, our Deputy Political Editor. Hi to you, Sam. Good morning. Good morning. Just shows how quickly things are moving when I'm talking to someone who only resigned this morning, and I'm also immediately asking him if he's going to stay, if he'll go back to his job if the Prime Minister remains in post, at least for now.
That's right, Kate. I'm here in Central Lobby, and it's hard to overstate the sense of bewilderment that I'm coming across with Conservative MPs of all stripes, including cabinet ministers, who are wandering around open-jawed at the situation, the constitutional crisis that we're in. We're in a government that has many, many vacancies unfilled, people unsure how it's going to operate over the coming weeks and months. I think there is a really live debate about what happens next in terms of the interim period before the Conservative Party get a new leader. That will happen, but the question is when and how. Cabinet ministers that I've been talking to this morning, deeply, deeply sceptical that Boris Johnson could do anything like hang on until October. And there's a very particular reason for that, Kay. That's because people around Boris Johnson appear to be planning a policy programme for the current Prime Minister, for Boris Johnson, to implement in the next few weeks and months. Let me just let you into what people around Boris Johnson are saying. They are making clear that, frankly, they are now putting together a package to prioritise prioritise the economy and bring forward planned announcements on tax cuts, which would otherwise be delayed by the leadership contest. In other words, to put that into English, a lame duck Prime Minister is preparing to make massive decisions consequential decisions about who should get tax cuts, whether or not there should be more borrowing, what should happen in the economy in this cost of living crisis right now, even though exactly all of those issues might be up for grabs, contested by the dozen or so names that you were just talking about with Beth, who might be standing for the leadership. So one cabinet minister was just going, how on earth could that happen? Sure, Boris Johnson could stay on perhaps until September, the start of September, so that the party in the country can have a chance to select who is the next Prime Minister. But the idea that he can go on longer than that and this is the specific bit, enact big policy decisions, well, that's just for the birds. And that's why you're getting ministers coming out and starting to say a lengthy period with Boris Johnson remaining in office, a sort of big farewell tour, Tony Blair style, would be untenable. If you look in the last few moments, Kwasi Kwarteng, business secretary, has just messaged on Twitter, what a depressing state of affairs, so much needless damage caused. We now need a new leader as soon as practicable, someone who can rebuild trust, heal the country and set out a new, sensible and consistent economic approach to help families. So there you've got a cabinet minister actually going on the record with his concern about any attempt by Boris Johnson to cling on. It's now July. We're talking about Conservative Party conference in October, which is rumoured to be the point at which Boris Johnson, is considering saying that he will stand down. But that's a long time for a country to be governed by a caretaker, effectively, Prime Minister. Boris Johnson's wings would be clipped if people knew that he was leaving office. He wouldn't have the full support to make massive decisions, it appears, of lots of Conservative MPs, which is why one of the big questions is just the timetable. Tory MPs are actually pretty confident that they might even be able to whittle down that dozen or so names to the last two that can go to the party in the country by the end of term, I think, as Beth was saying, so July the 23rd. So we've got just under 3 weeks to do that. The sort of knockout rounds in the past have taken just over a fortnight when they've been done at pace, as they were after the Brexit vote in the race that ended up with Theresa May in post. But you do have what is increasingly amongst cabinet ministers a sense of constitutional crisis right now over Boris Johnson's leaving date.
OK, Sam, thanks very much indeed. And so the controversy now moves not from whether the Prime Minister should resign, because he will be, and he'll make a statement later on today, but whether he should be allowed to remain as the interim Prime Minister until a new Prime Minister is chosen, a process that could take several weeks. I'm just hearing from one of my cabinet sources who says, I don't think he should be allowed to stay. I think that Dominic Raab, who is the Deputy Prime Minister, should be allowed to be the caretaker Prime Minister. Joining us now is Lord Heseltine, a former Deputy Prime Minister. Hello to you, my Lord. Thank you for joining us. What do you think should happen? Should Boris Johnson be allowed to stay?
I'm absolutely clear that we need a Deputy Prime Minister to act in the interregnum before the new Prime Minister is chosen. It's quite obvious that Boris Johnson, if he actually were allowed to stay, is going to try and put through a range of policies which will bolster his position, presumably for another go or something like that. So that's unthinkable. We're now dealing with a very short period in which a new leader is chosen, and there will have to be a pause in serious policy initiatives. But the critical thing, of course, here is that Boris is associated with one major policy, and that is it, and that is Brexit. And I coined the phrase, if Boris goes, Brexit goes. To me, the big and interesting dilemma is the way in which Keir Starmer has been wrong-footed in making these anti-European speeches as he has, on the basis that he was going to fight Boris Johnson. Now, of course, the Tory party is going to have to find a new leader. And my belief is that there will be a return to sanity towards our policies about Europe, which will make Keir Starmer look, I think, rather foolish and irrelevant. But certainly Boris has got to go, and he mustn't be allowed to sort of manoeuvre and manipulate power in the dying days of his premiership.
But, my lord, you know that the Conservative Party, the modern Conservative Party, wanted to get Brexit done. That's why Jeremy Hunt failed when he was in the two-horse race with Boris Johnson. 66% of those who voted, Conservative members around the country, said they wanted Boris Johnson. And the big issue then, as it is now, was Brexit. So any potential Prime Minister who comes forward will not say they want to go back into Europe.
Well, they won't say that, but they will, I think, say they want a totally more positive relationship with Europe. And if they don't, then they're going to build the opening for the Lib Dems in the south of England. You see, people quote what happened in the last general election. That's history. The important thing is what is happening in the by-elections and in public opinion. And public opinion has now seized Brexit as a disaster, and the Lib Dems are winning safe seats from the Conservatives in the south of England on the issue of Europe, amongst other things. So if the Tory party is going to have a ghost of a chance of going through the next few months, which are going to be very difficult economically, and then being a credible party in the next election, they're going to have to revert to that traditional Conservative position of building a power base in the centre of British politics. Now, don't tell me the party has got divisions on this subject. I fully understand that. But the extreme anti-Europeanism, right-wingism, is in fact a suicide course for the Tory party in the context of the economic circumstances we're facing.
I'm going to ask you this question for those who haven't heard me ask it before. Who do you think would best fit that role?
Well, look, I'm fully aware that I'm quite a controversial figure in the Tory party. So my endorsement could be toxic, and therefore I will remain like a clam, silent.
If I was to press you, might you indulge me?
Might I what?
Might you indulge me with a name if I were to press you and ask you again?
Even faced with your charm, I will remain clam-like.
Do you think there is enough time between now and recess, which is when all the MPs go on their summer holidays, to try to narrow down the... I mean, it's going to be a wide open race, isn't it, for those that would like to be the incumbent at number 10. Do you think there is enough time for Conservative MPs to narrow that down, whittle that down to 2?
Oh, yes, if they want to. And the fact is they will do it very rapidly. They're going on their holidays. They don't want this hanging all over the constituencies in that time. The thing, of course, the trouble is, and I personally would change this rule, I think that the idea of putting 2 people to the membership of the Tory party is actually a mistake, because the membership of the Tory party is a relatively small part of the Tory vote, and it tends to be rather activist, it tends to be rather extreme, and so there is an inbuilt instinct to go for the populist arguments that appeal to the Tory activists as opposed to the critical electorate, which is the one in the centre ground of British politics.
OK, we are going to hear from the Prime Minister to confirm what we already know, that he will be resigning today. What do you think? What do you want to hear from him?
Goodbye.
Yeah, maybe a little bit more than that, potentially?
Well, it's very difficult to know what he can say. I mean, he has been a disastrous Prime Minister in the conduct of the nation's affairs. I'm fully aware that he did a perfectly reasonable job over COVID, broadly the same as all our European equivalents. I know he's been supportive of the Ukrainian heroic defense, and I, of course, much support that. But any Prime Minister would have done the same. And there is that awful feeling reflected in Max Hastings' article in the Times today, that Boris saw it as an opportunity of, boosterism, bolsterism. I'm a Churchill, mini Churchill, not even a mini Churchill. So I'm afraid the cynicism in me tells me that really when it comes to it, what has Boris achieved? And Boris has achieved the trashing of Britain's international reputation, the trashing of the reputation of the Tory party, and left us facing an economy in very serious trouble about which the truth needs to be told. And with the devolution agenda, which has been much talked about, actually moving at a snail's pace.
You are, I think we're both, I was going to say of a certain age, I'm going to say experienced, and we've seen a few of these situations previously. Can you make any comparisons between this end of days and other Tory MPs who've had to go?
I think that there is one stark comparison, and that is dignity. Or in this case, the lack. Well, I mean, the fact, I mean, it is now a significant period since Michael Howard and William Hague, as former leaders of the party, said that the Prime Minister had to go. We saw 148 of his colleagues vote against him, and there, of course, were many more who would have done so in any second round. And there has been this sort of unedifying clinging to the rock against the inevitable prizing off. And it has been a very undignified process. And I can't think of any precedent from all the leadership battles that I've watched on the touchlines of now nearly 50 years in public life as unedifying as this one.
And my lord, what would you say to comments that I've been reading in the papers this morning that suggested that if a big beast like you had still been in politics today, he would not have turned you away last night and said, I'm still staying? In other words, it's those around him, not just the Prime Minister, for now, that is responsible for this unedifying spectacle.
I think that his colleagues should have acted more decisively and earlier. But I'm afraid that I subscribe to the view that the cabinet is basically Boris' friends. We have not got that traditional position of a good cabinet, which represents the wide spectrum of Tory party thinking.
OK. Thank you so much for joining us twice in 2 days, my lord. It's always a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. I wonder what Jacob Rees-Mogg thinks of all this.
Good morning, Mr. Mogg. Do you have a second to chat to me?
Good morning. Well, I need to get to... the Prime Minister has my support.
Does he maintain your support?
He maintains my...
Time for him to go today.
And that's him going through the Cabinet Office door. Don't be lulled into a false sense of security with that, though, because that door goes straight into number 10, if they want it to. So my bet is that he's going to be in with the PM right now, perhaps helping him write that resignation speech. Adam, standing by. Hi, Adam. What do you think?
Yeah, I've been listening to your interviews with fascination. I think Michael Heseltine certainly put his finger on it when he talked about that question of dignity or lack of dignity in this particular departure of a Prime Minister. I have to say, I've just been looking at all the various people speaking up now, saying that it's unacceptable that Boris Johnson should be a caretaker, perhaps as long as until October. Two wings of the Conservative Party, Ruth Davidson on the one hand saying he can't stay, Dominic Cummings on the other, although he's not officially a Conservative. He, of course, was the senior advisor to Boris Johnson. Kwasi Kwarteng has joined that list. George Freeman has joined that list. That's all within the Conservative Party. And then on the other hand, you've got the leaders of the opposition that we've been hearing from, Nicola Sturgeon and Ed Davey. So this is a continuing open sore after the news that Boris Johnson was going to go. And it may well, I think, be affecting the nature of his announcement and how he speaks to the nation. I mean, we should remember, Kay, that last night the Prime Minister and the Chancellor the new Chancellor, Nadhim Zahawi, were planning today on making a major economic speech to announce big changes in economic policy, quite possibly tax cuts. I don't even know whether those speeches are still going to go, that speech is still going to go ahead. And even if it does, is it binding? This is momentarily a mess. And worth noting, one of the things that Michael Heseltine said to you, it is possible, although I think unlikely, that the Conservative MPs could speed this process up. Were they to only have an election process and then put forward one candidate for the consideration of the membership, as we saw, for example, with Michael Howard, we wouldn't need to have this extensive period of maybe 6 weeks through August and September of the party membership being balloted because, as it were, the leader would emerge by acclamation at Westminster. Seems to me the Tory party is too riven with divisions and there are too many ambitious politicians out there for that to be a likely outcome. But that is just possible one way. We could have a proper Prime Minister by the time of the recess at the end of this month.
OK, but you think we will get to the situation where potentially, even as interim Prime Minister, it will be so toxic that he can't stay on?
I think there are many people who would regard it as unacceptable now for Boris Johnson to stay on. They don't trust him. It would be unacceptable for him to, as Michael Heseltine said, start launching major policy initiatives while he's a caretaker, admitted he's going. And I think it's his nature that he would want to do that as long as he is in Downing Street. So it seems to me that the outcome of this argument will follow the pattern of the outcome of the argument over whether Boris Johnson should go, and it will almost certainly be that it's inappropriate for him to stay on as a caretaker Prime Minister, which means I think most likely, I'm not definitive, but most likely at some point, maybe at the start of the recess, we'll see a caretaker take over, and I suspect that will probably be the Deputy Prime Minister, Dominic Raab. But that at this stage is speculation because all these things are being actively debated and discussed. And it's clear, as Boris Johnson said yesterday to the liaison committee, that he's going to fight at every step to still continue to have a role.
OK, Adam, for now, thanks. Beth's back with us. Hi, Beth. If you're just tuning our way, we are waiting to hear from Angela Rayner. She's going to be speaking. Urgent question in the House of Commons. We'll bring that to you just as soon as we can. Latest for us, please, Beth.
Well, we're just hearing that the Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss, and would-be Tory leadership candidate, she is definitely one that would want to run. We've been told that she's cutting short her trip to Indonesia and she is heading back.
Shall we listen to Angela Rayner? Sorry.
Moving. However, it's important the House is kept informed of developments in a timely and authoritative way. There are legitimate questions requiring answers about the functioning of government over this turbulent period. That is why I've granted the UQ we're about to hear. I remind all members that conventions and courtesies are here for a purpose. They allow us to discuss the most important issues without resorting to personal attacks. That is why I encourage all members to remember our constituents are watching events closely. Let us focus on the big issues, not the personality. I now come to the Deputy Leader for the UQ, Angela Rayner.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, for granting this very important UQ today to ask the Minister for the Cabinet Office if he will make a statement on the functioning of government.
Minister Ellis.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, as the House will be aware, it is widely reported that the Prime Minister is about to make an important statement shortly. I can confirm that it is correct that the Prime Minister will speak shortly. I cannot preempt the Prime Minister's statement, and the House and the nation will hear more imminently. In the meantime, the business of government continues, supported in the usual way by our excellent civil service. There will continue to be ministers of the Crown in place, including in all great offices of state. We must continue to serve our country, constituents, and the general public first and foremost. It is our duty now to make sure the people of this country have a functioning government. This is true now more than ever. The civil service is the foundation on which all governments function. The civil service continues to support across all government departments, and the country can be assured that this will always remain the case. I have spoken this morning to the Cabinet Secretary to that effect. Any transitional arrangements have always been made to allow for the business of government to continue. There are constitutional mechanisms in place to make sure that can happen. We await the Prime Minister's statement, but the House should be reassured that the government continues to function in the meantime. Any necessary ministerial vacancies can and will be filled. Other Secretaries of State can make decisions if necessary. There is a rich reserve of people who are both dedicated and talented, and who remain dedicated to serving our country and their constituents. Calmness and professionalism are now required. Our focus now is fully on the stability and continuity of government, Mr. Speaker. Now is the time to serve in the interests of our country, as it always is, and our constituents during the period ahead.
Angela Rayner.
I hate to break it to the Minister, but we don't have a functioning government. It will be good news for the country that the Prime Minister is to announce his resignation. He was always unfit for office. He has overseen scandal, fraud and waste on an industrial scale. But the chaos of the last 3 days is more than just petty Tory infighting. These actions, Mr. Speaker, have serious consequences for the running of our country. In the middle of the deepest cost of living crisis of a generation, with families unable to make ends meet, a dangerous war in Europe threatening our borders, and a possible trade crisis in Northern Ireland, Britain has no functioning government, no ministers in place to pass legislation, bill committees cancelled with no one to run them. Can the Minister confirm whether the 11 committees due to take place today will go ahead? Without ministers, what are the arrangements to pass primary and secondary legislation, and who will answer oral questions? How will this government continue to be democratically held to account? With the new Education Secretary resigning after 36 hours, which must be a record, there is not a single member in the Department of Education. What does this mean for children taking their exams? What does this mean for the impending childcare cost crisis? And our British national security is at risk too, not least because the Prime Minister thinks he can stay on. With the departure of the Northern Ireland Secretary, only 2 ministers are left able to sign security warrants to approve Secret Service use of sensitive powers. What contingency plans are in place to deal with emergencies in the short term, Mr. Speaker? The Prime Minister has said he will stay on as caretaker. How many more months of chaos does this country have to endure? With dozens of ministerial posts unfilled, who on earth will join the Prime Minister's government now? And how will a half-empty cabinet run the country until October? Mr. Speaker, they will try desperately to change the person at the top, but it's the same old Tory party in government.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I cannot preempt the Prime Minister's statement, and the House and the nation will hear more very shortly. But government and the civil service will continue to function in the meantime. The business of the House statement will be made shortly, and members can ask questions of the Leader of the House of Commons about the matter of the business of this place. But the House will continue to function and government business will continue to function. Other Secretaries of State can deal with issues for other departments constitutionally and legally in necessary circumstances.
John Whittingdale.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Without wishing to preempt the Prime Minister's statement, does my right friend agree that he can be proud of a large number of achievements of his government? But can I invite my right friend to preempt the opposition by making clear that Margaret Thatcher, David Cameron, Tony Blair, Theresa May all left office and were succeeded by new leaders and new prime ministers without there being a general election, and that the ship of state sails on?
He is, of course, completely correct.
Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I think as I came into the chamber, we were at 59 resignations and counting. It's a remarkable amount of leadership that was shown by the junior ministerial ranks rather than many of the cabinet. Now, I've been longing since I was elected for a cabinet of Remainers, but not necessarily of the kind that we've seen clinging like limpets to a rock. Now, today's announcement from the Prime Minister of his intention to resign comes after 2 years and 348 days in office, which, by supreme irony, is the same number of days as Neville Chamberlain spent in office as Prime Minister. And it's a Prime Minister who achieved Brexit under false pretences, purely as a part of his game to achieve entry to Downing Street. And in that 2 years and 348 days, he's left behind a trail of political chaos, of economic destruction, and leaving any reputation that the UK might have retained as a reliable international partner which stands up for the international rules-based order, trampled into the dust. We regularly in Scotland have to put up with patronising lectures about how well our government is performing, yet we have a government in Westminster where we have an education department with no education ministers, where we have 6 police forces in England which are under special measures, and a government that seems utterly paralysed and unable to deal with the major issues of the day. The idea that the Prime Minister can stay on and preside over this till the autumn is utterly risible. How long can this farce be allowed to continue? And how is it right that 300 Tory MPs will get to choose the next Prime Minister over that time, while denying the right of 5.5 million Scots to choose their own future?
The government and the civil service will continue to function in the meantime, as they always have done, and as they have done historically.
Well done.
Sir Christopher Cho.
Mr. Speaker, may I thank the Prime Minister for his great service to our nation and also to the people of Ukraine. And I think that people will rue the day that he was forced to resign. But can I say to my right honourable friend that isn't there a lot to be said for having a smaller cabinet, fewer ministers and hardly any parliamentary private secretaries? And can we have a pilot to show how successful that's going to be?
Minister.
Well, he makes a perfectly interesting point, but is somewhat outside the range of my responsibilities.
Dame Angela Riedel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have here a list of all of the resignations from government. Mr. Speaker, I wouldn't read them out, but there's plenty of tasty quotes in there that will be of use later on. The Minister can't sensibly argue that we have a functioning government when this number of people are missing. There are no ministers to do statutory committees and legislation even as we speak. So what is the way forward? He can't just blather at the dispatch box when the government's disintegrating around him.
The business of the House of Commons.
OK, so that's an urgent question in the House of Commons about the running of government. Confirmation also from the government benches that we are expecting a statement from the Prime Minister shortly. I'm hearing Beth's with us. I'm hearing it's going to be around midday, Beth.
Yeah, so we're expecting the Prime Minister to come out around midday and make this statement. And my mind's actually getting to what might he say. We know from the briefings from Number 10 in the past 48 hours, and also what the Prime Minister was saying to cabinet ministers and other parliamentarians, and what he said in the Commons too, that he was clear that he had a mandate of 14 million people who voted for him, and he really did not want to stand down. And I imagine when he comes out, he will want to run through some of his greatest hits. He will, I have no doubt, talk about Brexit, getting Brexit done, I imagine that he will want to talk about the pandemic, the vaccine rollout, and I imagine that it's going to be also a very, very difficult statement for him because he is a Prime Minister that really did not want to resign. He clung on to the very end, even last night, Number 10 briefing out that he was carrying on, that they were going to make an economic statement, that it was going to be business as usual. So it's going to be very difficult for him to stay on. So
I'm hearing actually that he's in a chipper mood. Typical of Boris Johnson.
Yeah, it's funny actually. Some of the cabinet ministers that saw him yesterday have said something similar to me, that he was very amicable yesterday, that he was clubbable yesterday, and it might be that he just uses that Boris Johnson bravado that we have come to know so well, and he comes out and he is full of
vim and vigour.
Wow, full of vigour is a good way of putting it. His kind of characteristic energy booster and vigour. You'll remember, I think we were here together when it happened, weren't we, Theresa May?
Yep.
We were here, weren't we,
yep.
together? And you remember that Theresa May came out, and you remember that she lost her voice.
She did.
She was so emotional. She said, "It's been a privilege to serve the country I love." And I remember it so well, that on The Country I Love, her voice broke, and she appeared to shed a tear, and then she went back in.
She was certainly sobbing as she walked back in, and her husband waiting just behind the door.
It was a really difficult. It was a difficult thing to watch, actually, because the difficulty that she had in accepting the time was up for her. It was over her face as she did that, and she's not a politician, as we know, to show emotion. So let's see how he handles it. But I imagine that he will want to give it some of his trademark, as I said, Boris Johnson boosterism.
Bear with me, if you would, please, Beth. Apparently she was at the opera earlier on in the week. It was a Greek tragedy. Make of that what you will. The Prime Minister, another moment in history being made with Beth and I here in the street at Number 10 when we are hearing from, hopefully, around midday, we'll be hearing from the Prime Minister as he makes his resignation speech. Stay tuned to Sky News for that. It's been made possible in part because of the actions of somebody like the Conservative MP Robin Walker, who resigned as the Schools Minister earlier on today. Hello to you, Mr Walker. Thanks for joining us. What took you so long?
Hello. I resigned yesterday and was, I think, the fourth minister to resign. I think for a lot of us, we wanted to give the Prime Minister every chance to try and put things right, to try and sort out some of the problems that we've seen in Downing Street, but had come to the conclusion that he hadn't been able to do that, and that therefore I didn't see that I could criticise others when Sajid and Rishi went. I didn't see that I could necessarily defend the position of the Prime Minister, and I felt it was the right thing to offer my resignation.
Yeah, again, why did it take you so long?
As I say, because we wanted to give him every chance to try and put things right. And we asked for assurances and we received them that changes were being made at Downing Street, that the culture had changed and that the things were going to be done differently in the future. Unfortunately, I think what we saw with the Chris Pincher affair is that they weren't being done differently. And we saw the same approach of absolute denials that we had seen on earlier issues where we had raised similar concerns. It was that, I think, that led so many colleagues independently to make up their minds to go and to say that we have to have a change of leadership. I'm glad that has now been accepted. I'm glad that we now do have a situation where the party in the country will be able to move forward, where we can move into selecting a new leader as swiftly as possible. And I think it's essential that we have that choice.
Now, not my words, but others from the opposition benches saying you're a group of absolute charlatans and you should definitely have done it before now. The writing was on the wall.
Well, they would say that, wouldn't they? I mean, I think it's absolutely right when you have a Prime Minister who's elected with a majority, that you give him every opportunity to deliver on the promises on which he was elected. And on a number of occasions, many of us in government have raised concerns about some of the issues in Downing Street. We were apologised to, we were given assurances that things were changing, that some of the people were changing. I think the problem is that the Prime Minister has not been able to win back the trust of his colleagues. And that is why many of us reluctantly took took the decision that although we're passionate about the jobs we're doing for the country and for the government, we couldn't carry on doing them under his leadership. Now, that issue is now resolved. He's accepted that, and after, I think, an unnecessarily protracted 24 hours in which so many good colleagues had to sacrifice their ministerial careers, we're now in a position where we can move forward. I think it's important that we resume the business of government as swiftly as possible, make sure that we are delivering on those priorities on which we were elected, but crucially also allow the party to move forward and get on with having a leadership contest so that we can choose the right person to take us forward.
Who's that?
Who is that? I think there will be a number of strong candidates coming forward in the days ahead. I personally hope that having shown the integrity that he has and consistently shown leadership and integrity, Sajid Javid will be among them. But I think there are a number of colleagues who have the ideas and the passion. My former boss, Nadeem Zahawi, I think has shown a strong start in the role of Chancellor in wanting to prioritise tax cuts. That's something a lot of us want to see and have been pushing for a long time. But there are a number of strong colleagues potentially in contention. I want to see what is the field that emerges. I want to see how those people perform and how they answer the questions on how we can deliver on that crucial 2019 manifesto, because that is what gave the party the majority to take this country forward. And that is the promises that we've made to the public, which we need to focus on delivering.
OK, let me ask you this. How long do you think the Prime Minister should remain as interim Prime Minister until we get a new Prime Minister? In other words, should he stay on until the autumn?
Well, look, the constitutional precedent is that the Prime Minister does tend to stay on until their successor has been elected. That is, as was just said in the House of Commons, the established precedent that happened with Tony Blair, with Margaret Thatcher and others. But I think there is a question for the parliamentary party here. And I know some colleagues will feel very strongly that they don't think the current Prime Minister should stay in post. I have to say, I think the priority should be getting on with the business of government and making sure that we do have a government that can deliver for the country. And I'm not going to rule out any particular individual as being that caretaker Prime Minister. I think the crucial thing is we need to get on and hold the leadership election as quickly as possible. We need to make sure that we can get a strong leader to take the party forward and someone who can unite the party. That's not going to be an easy task, but it's a crucially important one. It's a crucially important one for all of our constituents and for all parts of government where we need to get on with delivering a positive agenda.
Yeah, we seem to have lost focus a little bit on that camera there, rather like the Prime Minister has over the last couple of days or so. Isn't that what Deputy Prime Ministers are for, though? Shouldn't it be Dominic Raab who's filling in until we've got a new PM?
Well, as I say, I'm not ruling out any individual. I think the important thing is we get this decided, we get it decided quickly. If colleagues across the parliamentary party feel it's not right for the Prime Minister to stay on in a caretaker role, I would accept that. If colleagues across the party feel that he can continue, as indeed many of his predecessors did, I would accept that too. I think the most important thing now is that we do need to make sure that the business of government can go ahead. We do need to make sure that this leadership election takes place as swiftly as possible and with as strong a field of candidates as possible. I want there to be a genuine battle of ideas about how we can deliver on that 2019 manifesto effectively, how we can deal with the cost of living crisis, how we can deliver the tax cuts that people and that businesses need now in order to strengthen the economy and make sure that we go for growth. I think all of these things are crucially important. I think we have a short window of time to hold that contest and to get that decided so that we can then move forward decisively in the latter half of this year.
OK, it's good to talk to you. Thanks so much indeed for joining us on the programme this morning. Thank you. Well, what a morning it's been on an extended version of The Breakfast Show here on Sky News today. Coming up within about the next hour or so, we are expecting Boris Johnson, the present Prime Minister, to walk out of that door. And when he does, he's going to be resigning his post. He's done absolutely everything to stay in post. Some of his big dogs, as they're called, went in to see him yesterday, said the game is up. It's all over, Prime Minister, time for you to resign. He took absolutely no notice of them. He said he was going to remain in post. This morning, his Northern Ireland Secretary resigned. Lots of other people in between also resigned. But then his Chancellor made public a statement saying, Prime Minister, you have to go, and you have to go now. Was that the tipping point for Boris Johnson to say, OK, the game's up? Beth Rigby and Sophie Ridge will be here in just a moment.
Hello, this is Sky News Today, live from Downing Street. It's 11 o'clock, the headlines. Boris Johnson is to resign as Prime Minister less than 3 years after entering Downing Street. He's inside number 10 right now, and we are expecting a statement shortly. His resignation followed yet more resignations today. The number who've quit the government is now over 50. And already MPs are calling for the Prime Minister to leave Downing Street now and to hand over to a caretaker leader. We'll be looking back on the career of the man who secured Brexit, brought down by parties and a sex scandal. Well, it is over. After an unprecedented 48-hour power struggle with his MPs, Boris Johnson has agreed to resign as Prime Minister. More ministerial departures, taking the total number to over 59, and a public letter from his newly appointed Chancellor appear to have finally convinced him that it's time to go. Now, the issue is whether he stays on until a new leader is elected, that would be by the Conservative Party, or whether he leaves sooner. These are the key issues. Now, I can tell you that the conversations that I've been having with number 10, that the Prime Minister is currently trying to fill some of those vacancies in his government. We know that there are an awful lot after the all of those resignations that happened, and apparently, according to number 10, they are being accepted. Whether or not that is true, we'll obviously be testing in the hours to come. Our political editor, Beth Rigby, is with us now, so we know that he's going to resign. I think the question, I guess, is whether he can stay on.
So you mean whether he can stay on as Prime Minister? Yeah, that's being contested at the moment. There are some Cabinet Ministers that are saying to me that they are happy for him. There's Rob Oxley, who's just come out. He is Nadine Dorries' advisor. Now, you know Nadine Dorries is one of Boris Johnson's most loyal supporters, so he coming out now. I wonder if Nadine Dorries is in there as the Prime Minister finishes off that resignation statement. But look, there's a couple of things going on this morning, as you said. Questions about whether or not they can convince other people to come back in and serve in government, given that there are now, I think let me look at the screen, I've lost count, 59 government resignations, and five cabinet ministers have also stood down in the past 24 hours, so that needs sorting out, and people, I'm sure, will be asked to serve, because ultimately what the government can't have now is a government that can't govern, given what we are about to lose a Prime Minister and a Conservative Party leader. But then the question is about Boris Johnson and can he stay on? And I've had different conversations this morning with different sources. Some cabinet ministers telling me that they think it's OK for him to stay on and hand over power. One saying to me that there is a constitutional precedent that is done. But you've seen with some former ministers and MPs making it clear that they don't think he should stay on, that they would rather have a caretaker government. There was a report by the brilliant Jason Groves, actually, in the Mail last night, the political editor of the Daily Mail, that there was some talk about Theresa May coming back as a caretaker Prime Minister. So that is a live discussion at the moment. But where are we now, right here? We don't get too far ahead of ourselves. We're expecting him to come out, as Kay was saying, she had heard midday. I've been told it's a bit fluid around lunchtime. We expect him to come out, to stand at the podium and make this resignation speech.
And the tone of that will be really fascinating to see, won't it? I mean, this is a man who, it feels like, tried to resist the resignation right until the last possible minute. What tone do you think, knowing Boris Johnson, you've interviewed him like many times, what sort of tone do you think he will strike when he does come out here for his big moment?
Well, it has been the most staggering 24 hours in modern politics that I have ever covered, and I'm quite old now. I've been doing this job for quite a long time. It really has been quite astonishing to watch this unfold. And on Tuesday night, when Sajid Javid and Rishi Sunak resigned, at that point, we said, and Molly, my producer, and I said, we think this is the moment. This is the moment that is going to begin the snowball effect. Then the cabinet rallied around him, actually, but the next morning, these resignations. But through all of this astonishing 48 hours, one thing stayed true, and that was Boris Johnson's commitment to staying in there. And it was literally only when Brandon Lewis this morning resigned at dawn. I woke up to it on my phone. Simon Hart resigning at 11 o'clock last night. Suella Braverman, his Attorney General, on the Peston show last night, saying that she no longer supports him, and also saying that she wanted to run herself. It was only really when dawn broke and the realisation dropped for him that whatever he wanted, he had no cabinet, he couldn't fill posts, he couldn't stay on. So you just asked me, well, what do I think the tone will be? It's been defiance up to now, but I've been told by people that have had conversations with him last night and this morning that the mood is amicable, that he is upbeat, if anything. And I imagine that what he will want to do as he addresses not all of us here, although, I mean, there are hundreds of...
it's a pretty full street by now,
yeah, there's a very full street, but he's not really addressing us. He's addressing the entire country, and he wanted to stay on because he believed that he said it in the Commons yesterday at PMQs, a colossal mandate were his words. 14 million people had voted for him, and he will want to speak to those people. And I imagine that what he will want to do is present with his vigour and vim and boosterism that has come to characterise his time at number 10. But it must be so difficult for him, Sophie. I mean, he was a Prime Minister that was elected with 80-seat majority. We thought he might go 2 terms. He thought he might go 3. I mean, he was saying that just 2 weeks ago to journalists in Rwanda, and actually the reality is he will come out of there and he will end his premiership as one of the shortest-serving Conservative Prime Ministers in history.
I do wonder, because obviously, he, as you say, he would be one of the shortest in history. If he does make it to autumn, I believe that he then overtakes Theresa May. I wonder if that's at the back of his mind slightly. Someone was definitely concerned about his legacy.
He was concerned about his legacy, and he's competitive. So he wanted to beat David Cameron, he wanted to beat Theresa May.
They haven't got a great relationship anyway.
He will find it very difficult having to stand down mid-term. And also, you can imagine that he feels quite angry about it because he will feel like he won these seats for these MPs. He got Brexit over the line. He broke the impasse back in 2019, and now he has to go. But this is not a presidential situation. It's a parliamentary democracy. You might get a mandate from the people, but you have to have the confidence of your cabinet and your parliamentary party to stay on as Prime Minister. And once you've lost that, you're out of power. You can't stay in office.
I'm interested to know your thoughts on whether he will be able to stay until the autumn, which we know is what he wants to do.
I think it's very contested. And, you know, I'm speaking to some cabinet ministers who are saying, I think so. I spoke to another who said, I simply don't know. A couple of cabinet ministers said to me that they thought he should be able to. So it's quite contested at the moment. What we can say for sure is his intention is that he wants an orderly handover of power as he would see it. He would like to stay on and see through the summer, and then once a new Conservative leader is in place by party conference, he will step down. But, you know, Sophie, on this as well, with the timings, I don't know what will happen yet. I mean, with the Theresa May situation, we thought we were going to have a leadership race, and in the end she was anointed Prime Minister with Boris Johnson. We went through rounds and rounds. Who did we have? We had Sajid Javid and Jeremy Hunt, Boris Johnson, there was Rory Stewart, who else was
James
there?
Cleverly.
James Cleverly. I can't remember. But, you know,
an awful lot.
Michael Gove, do you remember Michael Gove? So, you know, there were half a dozen of them. Dominic Raab, they all launched their leadership bids, and then it was whittled down. And
we've already seen people coming out the blocks already, right, time round.
So the thing is this time, and this is what a former cabinet minister told me last night as we were talking very late into the night. They said the issue here for the party and for government now is there's no plan B. It's not like the parliamentary party ousted Boris Johnson because they had a pretender or they had a PM in waiting in the way that Theresa May was ousted because there was a big group in the party that wanted to put a Brexiteer in. That's not the situation here. They've literally got him out because they don't want him to be Prime Minister anymore, because they think it's a drag anchor on the Conservative brand, because they no longer want to serve under him. So they don't have a plan B. So in that sense, it's quite wide open, this race.
And I guess because of that, they are going to need some kind of caretaker leader in the months ahead while the leadership contest plays out. Will it be Dominic Raab? Will it be Theresa May, as you were mentioning? Or the other question, I guess, is whether Boris Johnson is allowed to stay on. To do that, he would then need, of course, people that have resigned, handed in those resignation letters to say that they haven't got trust in him, to effectively re-accept their jobs or to find enough people on the backbenches to fill it. Do you think it's possible?
Well, these are all the questions this morning, aren't they? The number one, he wants to stay on. Will the party let him? And the Cabinet, from my conversations with a number of people today, is divided on that. And number two, how on earth are they going to fill those 59 government posts? Now, some of them are ministerial aids, but, you know, there are a number of cabinet posts vacant and there are a number of Minister of State, so senior ministerial roles. Those roles will have to be filled, and there will be a discussion going on in there at the moment about whether or not they can bring cabinet ministers back or whether they can bring those ministers back into post, of course.
Thank you so much, Beth. We'll have plenty more, of course, from political editor Beth Wrigley as the afternoon goes on. But what we can tell you, of course, is that in number 10, Boris Johnson is attempting to fill some of those vacant roles. Well, let's go to our deputy political editor, shall we now? Sam Coates is in Parliament's central lobby for us. Sam, what have you been hearing?
Bewilderment, I think, from Conservative MPs as people try to navigate this, frankly, constitutional crisis. The latest in the last few moments is there are some cabinet ministers, I'm being told, that are currently trying to unresign, get back into their posts because it's so uncertain whether Boris Johnson continues for weeks or months, whether Dominic Raab or another caretaker comes along. What we also know is that there are people very close to Boris Johnson who are effectively trying to draw up a legacy for him. He wants to do tax cuts in however much long, in whatever form he can, in whatever time he has left. But the question, Sophie, is what happens next? And we have some intelligence. This morning, YouGov conducted a poll of Conservative members, the people who are going to determine the next Tory leader and hence the next Conservative Prime Minister who will succeed Boris Johnson. And it has found that in pole position, the person who would succeed Boris Johnson, according to this poll, is Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary. YouGov's Tory members poll makes clear that Ben Wallace beats Liz Truss, the Foreign Secretary, Penny Mordaunt, Rishi Sunak, who was Chancellor, and Jeremy Hunt. Liz Truss comes out second, Penny Mordaunt third, and Liz Truss, and then Jeremy Hunt way below. Clearly, some of the dozen or so names not in that poll, Nadhim Zahawi, for instance, Suella Braverman, Steve Baker, weren't polled. But Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary who has been at Boris Johnson's side all the way through, is coming out on top. According to this Tory members poll, he would beat Liz Truss by 48% of Tory members to 29% who'd vote for Liz Truss. Just above how much he would beat Penny Mordaunt by Rishi Sunak by a similar margin as well. This would be remarkable because Ben Wallace, he has been a long-time Boris Johnson supporter. He's earned his spurs particularly not only through the withdrawal of Afghanistan, but more recently through his handling of the Ukraine crisis. He routinely comes out top of other membership surveys, particularly the one by Conservative Home. But here's the thing, Sophie. That would mean that Tory members who are overwhelmingly Brexit actually are happy to consider a Remainer to succeed Boris Johnson. That's a remarkable turnaround. That tells you quite a lot about where the party is at the moment, pushing down Brexit perhaps as a priority, rising up other issues such as statesman-like leadership and ability to engage on the media. Those are the kind of qualities that Ben Wallace has been admired for by Tory MPs. And those are the kinds of reasons that the membership might be lining up behind Ben Wallace. We're in for a hell of a contest. It's quite possible that MPs will have to whittle down the field from the dozen or so people likely to stand down to the last two candidates, possibly even before the summer recess in less than 3 weeks. But as it stands, if those last two candidates include Ben Wallace, MPs put him through, he beats pretty much any other contender, including those who've been hard at it with behind-the-scenes leadership campaigns for some time.
Thank you very much, Sam. Sam Coates there reporting for us in Central Lobby, right there in the heart of Westminster. Well, we're waiting, of course, for the Prime Minister's statement, potentially expecting that around midday. We're told that we will be hearing some ministerial appointments shortly as Boris Johnson tries to dig in and allow himself to remain in post as a caretaker leader until the autumn. Well, let's bring in Adam Bolton, shall we? The former Sky News political editor and presenter. Adam, good to see you again in the Sky News studio. Have you ever seen anything like this in your long time as political editor?
No, I've never seen anything like this before, because even although it may have been a very sad and emotional time, we've always had an orderly transition of power. We've always known who is taking over, even for an interim period. And by and large, the existing government of the outgoing leader has stayed in place. Now, on this occasion, we don't know who's in government and who isn't, because there have been these more than 50 resignations. As you heard, Boris Johnson, the outgoing Prime Minister, is saying he's going to make new ministerial appointments. They're very senior figures in the Conservative Party, let alone beyond it, saying that it's inappropriate that Boris Johnson should stay on as caretaker. So the sheer mess is characteristic of Boris Johnson, but it's not something we've ever seen before in a transition of Prime Minister. And secondly, of course, the nature of this departure is very important. It's all about the character and the behaviour of one man. It's not a policy issue in any sense. And again, that is new, if you like, in British politics, even with the departure of Margaret Thatcher, which, of course, was after 3 general election victories and a great many transformative political experiences. Yes, it was true that people were fed up with her increasingly high-handed ways, but in the end, at the heart of it was a policy issue about her treatment of the European Union and its allies, and her attitude she was adopting towards further European integration. So, again, policy was at the heart of it, and Michael Heseltine was very much the focus of that opposition, although, of course, he didn't emerge as leader. Now, on this occasion, we don't really have any significant policy disagreements. Critics of the government would say that that's because we haven't had any significant policy initiatives beyond getting Brexit done. And we're left with very important issues, such as negotiating changes to the Northern Ireland Protocol in the balance. And we also, of course, were expecting today a major economic statement by the new Chancellor, Nadhim Zahawi, with the Prime Minister, quite possibly bringing forward tax cuts. Now, we don't know if that's going ahead. We also don't know really what the status of Mr. Zahawi is, given this extraordinary 48 hours when, first of all, he took the position of Chancellor under Boris Johnson, and then this morning issued a public letter saying he thought Boris Johnson should stand down. In those circumstances, can he, with any credibility, present a new economic policy? So the chaos and the focus on one individual, Boris Johnson, are unique to this situation. We've never seen the like of it.
Thank you very much, Adam Bolton. Always interesting to hear your thoughts on these kind of occasions. Adam Bolton there. Well, as we wait for the Prime Minister's statement here in Downing Street, we wait to hear whether or not he is managing to fill some of those ministerial jobs, whether people are agreeing to serve in the sort of temporary cabinet. We can now speak to Sir David Lidington, who is the former Cabinet Office Minister and also the former Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster under Theresa May. Thank you very much for being with us. It's a little bit different, isn't it, Mr. Lidington, compared to Theresa May's last days in office? What do you make of the way that Boris Johnson has chosen to resign?
I think it's a good thing in my view that he's decided to go today. I think that this does give him the chance to leave office with at least some measure of dignity, rather than be hauled out after another vote of no confidence next week. So I think it's the best way available forward for the country and for the Conservative Party now.
Boris Johnson has said that he wants to effectively remain in post as a caretaker leader until the autumn, by which time there will be time for the Conservative Party to appoint a new leader. Do you think he should be given that time, or do you think the party should act now and appoint a different caretaker leader?
I think that's up to Conservative MPs. It's a question of whether, in the light of what's happened, the parliamentary party, it's a mixture of the 1922 committee and those who still remain in office, particularly those who are still in the cabinet, as to whether they want Mr. Johnson to continue or whether they want.
What's your view? You must have a view on this.
My view is that it would probably be cleaner if he just gave way to Dominic Raab and let Dominic act as a caretaker leader, which he did perfectly competently while Mr. Johnson was so ill with COVID a couple of years ago. And what's important, I think, is that whether it's Boris Johnson or whether it's John Raab or somebody else, they observe the limitations that there would be in such a period. I mean, when David Cameron, when Theresa May, Tony Blair, going further back, were in this sort of interim period while their successor was being chosen, they couldn't launch any new initiatives. They could try to do a certain amount of stuff to demonstrate a legacy. They would be available to take the essential decisions of government. We are supporting Ukraine in a major war in Europe. There could be a terrorist or cyber attack on this country at any time. That's something every prime minister has to live with constantly. So somebody has to be available to respond and take decisions in the cases of emergency and to make sure the business of government ticks over. But no more than that. I mean, there can't be any question of a caretaker prime minister having the authority to launch some great new programme that's going to require fresh legislation. So I think it's observing the limitations, making sure that whoever is caretaker consults with the potential leadership contenders so that there is as smooth a transition as possible to whoever is elected to succeed Boris Johnson.
Interesting stuff. Thank you very much for coming on the programme and giving us your thoughts. David Lidington there. We can talk now to Chris Philp, the Conservative MP who resigned as Minister for Technology and the Digital Economy in protest about Boris Johnson's leadership. He resigned earlier this morning. Let's bring in Mr. Philp now, shall we? You, of course, I think will probably be familiar to many of our viewers as someone who's gone out to defend Boris Johnson time and time again. What made you change your mind and decide that he's no longer...
Hello, I'm having a little trouble hearing you because I've got multiple sound channels coming through. But eventually I was just unable to reconcile... Hello?
Hello, we can hear you.
I've got multiple sound
channels. Keep going. We can hear you if you want to keep talking. Understand if it's a bit impossible for you, though. OK, we'll come back to you, shall we? We'll come back to you, Chris Philp, when we try and re-establish communication with him. Let's bring Adam Bolton back in now, shall we? And Adam, I'm interested to know your thoughts there. David Lidington telling us that he thinks it would be cleaner for Dominic Raab, the Deputy Prime Minister, to effectively step in as a caretaker leader, although saying how important it is effectively that he, whoever it is, follows the rules, if you like, or the expectation that there'll be no major policy announcements. Do you think that we will end up with Boris Johnson being able to continue until the autumn, or do you think that it is actually more likely that we could see someone such as Dominic Raab taking over?
I think there is an emerging consensus, really coming from senior politicians on all sides, that in these circumstances it would be inappropriate for Boris Johnson to stay on as a caretaker prime minister now that he's agreed he's going. I mean, I've just been looking at a list of Conservatives ranging from Ruth Davidson and Kwasi Kwarteng, all the way through to the leaders of the opposition parties, all saying it's just not appropriate in this area. And that's because, in a sense, this whole matter, Boris Johnson is going because of a breakdown in trust in him. And can you possibly allow someone whose own party are getting rid of him because they've lost trust in him, to be anywhere near the levers of power for the next 3 months. A lot of people regard that as being pretty difficult. And we have had periods before when there's been a transition in party leadership where there have been caretakers taking charge. But I suspect behind closed doors in Downing Street, this is an argument that is still going on. And I suspect Boris Johnson is fighting pretty hard to have the opportunity to give himself a rousing send-off, possibly with some policy decisions. That's certainly the message which we're getting from the news, that he's still talking about making fresh government appointments. I doubt that he will prevail. And I think it would be very damaging for the Conservative Party going forward if he does. But who can tell? There aren't written rules about these circumstances of transition.
Interesting stuff. Adam, thank you very much. Well, I'm told we can now return to Chris Philp. Hopefully you should be able to hear me a little bit more clearly this time. So I guess my question to you this morning is, do you accept that Boris Johnson can carry on as a caretaker leader until the autumn, or do you think that he does actually need to step aside and let someone else do that?
Well, I think there are a couple of things. Firstly, we need to make sure that we keep the basic functions of government going. That's really important. There are, for example, no ministers in DfE at the moment. That needs to be sorted out. Secondly, I think we need to try and select a new leader as quickly as we reasonably can. And obviously, we need to make sure we make the correct choice, but we should do it in a reasonably quick time. In terms of Boris staying on, the convention is that the outgoing Prime Minister does carry on. That's what happened when Theresa May left office, is what happened when David Cameron left office. And given that, as we just heard, the caretaker Prime Minister can't really introduce any new policy or any significant new legislation. I don't really see any major problem, but I haven't really given it deep thought, to be honest.
We can hear the noisy band behind you, so thank you for battling on with that in the background. Just to be crystal clear then, you're talking about the kind of convention of a caretaker leader. Would you accept Boris Johnson staying on till the autumn? So if he asked you, for example, to serve, gave you a job, would you accept it?
Well, I think all of us in public life are here to serve the country, and if I was able to do that in whatever capacity, then obviously I'd be happy to serve. I mean, when I resigned this morning, one of the things that I really weighed heavily on my mind was the fact that I was working on bringing forward the gambling review, reviewing our gambling legislation for the first time in 17 years.
So just and on to jump in, because I want to be really clear. You resigned this morning, but if Boris Johnson, now that he has set out a timetable for leaving, if he asked you to re-accept a job, you would say yes?
If I was asked to help out with getting the online safety bill through Parliament, OK, I would be willing to help out in whatever way I could, right? In any capacity, whoever the leader was, whoever the circumstances were, right? Because that's a matter of public service. I'm not, by the way, to be clear, I'm not asking for that. I'm not expecting it. I resigned, and when you resign, right? But if I can help them out practically, obviously I'll give them practical assistance.
Throwing forward,
I'm not asking for cutbacks, to be clear.
Don't worry, that's come across loud and clear. Okay. But if it were to be offered, then I think we know what the answer would be. That is also clear. I'm interested to know, because we're going to have a leadership contest, obviously. Is there any standout candidates that you would like to see throw their hat in the ring?
To be honest, I only resigned from government a few hours ago, as you just said, so I haven't given that any thought until... I mean, some colleagues have been thinking about this. Obviously, I'm not one of them, because I was just busy getting on with things like the gambling review and the online safety bill until just a few hours ago. So that's not a topic I've really thought about.
Right, so I actually have some breaking lines about the Carol about to be appointed.
OK, very understandable there. I'm going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much for being with us, Mr Philp, and giving us some lines there. We can now go back to our political editor, Beth Rigby, who's with us in Downing Street this morning. Beth, you've got some breaking lines for us.
Well, yeah, there's some developing news now. I'm told that a new cabinet is going to be announced shortly, that Boris Johnson is filling those posts that have been vacated in the past 24 hours. I've been told that Greg Clark, you might remember him, he was the former business secretary and a key Remainer under Theresa May, summarily sacked by Boris Johnson when he became leader, and he became one of those groups of MPs. I think at one point maybe even the whip was withdrawn from him from memory. I'd need to check that. He is going back to become the levelling up Secretary of State, so replacing Michael Gove. And we haven't got any other names yet for sure, but some rumours about a promotion for Conor Burns, one of Boris Johnson's loyalist lieutenants, and maybe about Kit Malthouse too. Again, we were talking about him yesterday, the policing minister that was part of the delegation that told Boris Johnson that it was time to go but didn't himself resign. Might he get promoted too? So we were talking about the need to fill posts in government, the need to make sure that the country and departments around Whitehall can function. And Boris Johnson, before he makes that statement of resignation, we're expecting an announcement on a filled cabinet.
That's astonishing, really, isn't it, that Greg Clark is one of the first names to come out on that really important job, levelling up, Beth, obviously one of the key parts of Boris Johnson's whole legislative programme. Do you think that shows how...
So I'm jumping because I keep seeing the door. I expect
Greg
Greg
Clark
as well.
Any moment of that door, anyone comes out, we would be on it.
Or who's going to walk up? I don't know if they'll do the... I mean, normally in a cabinet reshuffle, this is the weirdest one I've ever known of, but normally in a cabinet shuffle, they walk up so we know who's coming and going.
Greg Clark yet. Natural Boris Johnson ally by any stretch of the imagination. Do you think that indicates, the difficulties that he's going to be having in filling some of these positions?
Look, part of the issue for Boris Johnson when he became Prime Minister in 2019 is that one of the problems in 2019 for Boris Johnson, or one of his decisions rather, was that he made a cabinet that was a Brexiteer cabinet. He had such a big majority, he felt he didn't need to bring together other parts of the party. He basically sacked every single person that was a Remainer. Jeremy Hunt, who was his contender in the leadership race, he was gone, despite all his ministerial experience, and that raised eyebrows amongst people. They thought, Jeremy Hunt has run a race against you, he's lost, but he's a good cabinet minister in the eyes of many of his colleagues, and you've booted him out. Greg Clark booted out. Who else? Damien Green, who served under Theresa May, he was gone.
And even people like Penny Mordaunt, who supported Brexit but went for a different leadership candidate, it felt that they were perhaps punished in some of those cabinets.
Well, Penny Mordaunt was also kicked out of cabinet, although she's now a Minister of State. And what's interesting about Penny Mordaunt is that we were all expecting her to resign, that she was on resignation watch, and she didn't. But we do expect that Penny Mordaunt will make a run for it as one of the leading Brexiteer candidates. But going back to Greg Clark, he was an arch Remainer. He was one of the gang with Amber Rudd. You remember her, the former Home Secretary. She's now out of government, with Oliver Letwin. Do you remember him? He was a former cabinet minister. I mean, and Greg Clark. These were some of the names. And Rory Stewart. They were the people that really challenged Boris Johnson on Brexit, and they were the people that in the end got kicked out of government. So for Greg Clark to come back to becoming the levelling up minister, I mean, it just shows that, well, what does it show us? That the game's over for Boris Johnson now, so he's just trying to fill the post rather than build a loyal team around him. And also, Greg Clark's a safe pair of hands. I mean, he's the chair of the Technology Select Committee, who was the Business Secretary of State. So he is a capable minister to run that department for him. And given that Boris Johnson sacked Michael Gove, I don't think it's going to be very easy to get him back.
Yeah, I think that's probably very well concluded. Beth, thank you very much. We'll obviously come back to you with any more breaking lines as well. So Greg Clark there appointed the new Levelling Up Secretary, replacing the sacked Michael Gove. And it does certainly feel now that Boris Johnson is digging in, that he is trying to refill some of those vacant roles. Greg Clark has obviously agreed to serve, we understand. Chris Philp there, the junior minister, who resigned just this morning, telling us that he would be prepared to serve again if Boris Johnson was to ask him. So does this mean that he will get his wish of being able to stay on till autumn? We're going to find out in the hours ahead. We can speak now to Sarah Southern, who is a former Conservative advisor. Thank you very much for being on the programme, Sarah. Do you think Boris Johnson will be able to stay on until the autumn?
I really hope he doesn't. I think it's time that he moved on. one thing that has happened in previous leadership contests is that people think they can set their timeline as to when they will walk out of number 10. It happened to David Cameron. You know, he thought he would have 3 months. I think he ended up having about 3 weeks from, you know, the Brexit result through to Theresa May walking into number 10. So hopefully it will be quite a quick transition.
We're hoping it will be a quick transition, but certainly all the noises from number 10, it does feel as if Boris Johnson would like to stay until the autumn. As a Conservative yourself, how concerned are you about the damage to the party brand that has been done over the last, well, I was going to say a few days, but really it's been a few weeks, hasn't it, with the kind of changing lines on various scandals, on a feeling among many Conservative MPs that there is a lack of integrity in number 10. How easy will it be for the Conservatives to shake off that reputation?
Well, this has been months. You know, I, as a party activist myself, I've totally disengaged with the party. I wasn't involved in any of the local elections. I can't admit that I even supported them in the local elections. So there are certainly people who have felt totally distanced from the party in recent months because of what's gone on. We want to see the party come back together, have a leader that we can unite behind, that we can then, you know, put together a really strong government so that when we do go into a general election in 23 or 24, we're able to really support that.
OK, thank you so much. Interesting to get your thoughts there. Sarah Southern there, former aide to David Cameron. Well, it's been a difficult few days for the Conservative Party, no doubt. We can get the reaction now from Keir Starmer. He has been talking in Westminster this morning. Let's have a listen to what he had to say.
He needs to go completely. None of this nonsense about clinging on for a few months. He's inflicted lies, fraud and chaos in the country. And, you know, we're stuck with a government which isn't functioning in the middle of a cost of living crisis. And all of those that have been propping him up should be utterly ashamed of themselves. We've had 12 years of a stagnant economy, 12 years of broken public services, 12 years of empty promises. Enough is enough. And the change we need is not a change at the top of the Tory party. It's much more fundamental than that. We need a change of government and a fresh start for Britain.
It doesn't look like he'll get a general election if he just swaps leaders.
He needs to go. He can't cling on in this way. His own party have finally concluded that he's unfit to be Prime Minister. They can't now inflict him on the country for the next few months. It's obvious he's unfit to be Prime Minister. That's been blindingly obvious for a very, very long time. And if they don't get rid of him, then Labour will step up in the national interest and bring a vote of no confidence, because we can't go on with this Prime Minister clinging on for months and months to come.
Wouldn't that unite the Conservative Party?
I don't think anything is going to unite this Conservative Party. They're tearing each other apart. And what we've got in the middle of a cost of living crisis is a government that can't function. And that's why I say he can't cling on now. They've declared him unfit to be Prime Minister. They can't inflict him on the country for the next few months. If they don't get rid of him, we will bring that vote of no confidence in the national interest, because we can't go on with this broken government led by this discredited Prime Minister.
Boris Johnson, in some ways, was your biggest asset if you were going to go to the country. When you lose him, you will have more of a problem, won't you?
Look, the Conservative Party has been in power for 12 years. 12 years of a stagnant economy. 12 years of broken public services. 12 years of empty promises. We need a fresh start. And that's why I say changing the person at the top of the Conservative Party is not the fundamental change that we need. We need a change of government. We need a fresh start for our country.
But it doesn't look like you will get the general election you would want now, does it?
Well, we need fundamental... The country's crying out for change. We've been stuck with a government that's not been functioning in the middle of a cost of living crisis. And now changing the person at the top of the Conservative Party is not going to make any difference whatsoever. People want change, a fresh start for Britain. And that means we need a change of government. We need a Labour government.
Is there nobody that you would rate as a good opponent? Someone will be in against you?
For me, this isn't a question about who leads the Conservative Party. It's much more fundamental than that. They've been in power for 12 years. of empty promises, broken promises, a stagnant economy, wages very, very low, inflation and prices through the roof. We need fundamental change. We need a fresh start for Britain. We need a change of government. We need a Labour government.
Lastly, I just want to ask you, given what you say about the government, you haven't cut through as you might want to. How can you do something about that now?
We've come from a general election in 2019 where we did very badly, to local elections this year where we made considerable ground, and a by-election win 2 weeks ago today in Wakefield with a huge swing to the Labour Party. So we're on track, and that's why we say the change we need is a change of government, a Labour government. We're ready for that.
Thank you, Mr Starmer.
Thank you.
Keir Starmer there, the leader of the Labour Party, giving his reaction after Boris Johnson said he is going to step down. He said that Boris Johnson can't cling on any longer. He's obviously unfit to be Prime Minister. And he said that if Conservative MPs do allow him to stay on for the months that he would like until the autumn, he said that Labour will bring a vote of no confidence. So in other words, Labour will try and force Boris Johnson from office if his own party don't do it instead. The country is crying out for change. He went on to say all of those who have propped him up should be ashamed of themselves. Well, let's bring in Adam Bolton, shall we, the former Sky News political editor and presenter, for some reaction to those words from Keir Starmer. Adam, it's quite difficult, isn't it, for oppositions to really find space in these moments. What did you make of what Keir Starmer had to say?
Well, first of all, that was the leader of the opposition adding his voice to those people saying it is unacceptable for Boris Johnson to stay on as a caretaker Prime Minister until the Conservatives have chosen a new leader, and saying that he would try and use really the only weapon the opposition have in these circumstances of tabling a vote of no confidence in the House of Commons if the Conservative Party decides that Boris Johnson can stay on as a caretaker. Now, that is really a very, very powerful weapon, but in order to be successful, it would require a large number of Conservatives to vote with the opposition parties, or at the very least to abstain in that vote of no confidence. If that vote of no confidence were to pass the House of Commons, the most likely outcome would then be a general election, because the government would have lost the confidence of Parliament, and in those circumstances a general election would follow. Now, Keir Starmer, like the other opposition parties, says that they would want a general election because it would give them the opportunity to get rid of this government. But at the same time, it may not necessarily be in their interest to go to the country at the moment, and B, they don't actually want to plunge the country into the chaos of having a general election, particularly when it be uncertain who was leading the Conservative Party. So he's got a very difficult road to tread, because the only way he can express opposition is by doing that effectively, but it does have the risk of possibly ending up in a general election. Now, what's going on at the moment is Boris Johnson has still not publicly declared that he's stepping down as Prime Minister, and he is using his guttering power to act as a Prime Minister by appointing this cabinet, making it more difficult for the transition period, because people are going to say, well, you know, you're appointed by a Prime Minister who then said he's going to resign. Are you in office? And of course, it already raises a problem for the head of state, because you'll know very well that from those press releases we get from Downing Street when their ministerial changes, it says the Queen has been pleased to appoint so-and-so in this particular role. Well, the Queen's got to decide whether this is just fantasy cabinets now being played by Boris Johnson, or whether it's something that she should endorse, particularly since he says he's going, but he hasn't gone yet. So he's just creating more and more chaos and mess against the national interest.
Adam Bolton, thank you very much indeed. The Queen deciding whether or not they are playing fantasy cabinets, according to Adam Bolton. Well, in the meantime, those appointments are now being confirmed. As our political editor Beth Rigby broke just a few moments ago, we are now being told that Greg Clark is the new Levelling Up Secretary, that now being officially confirmed by Number 10. So it seems as though the Prime Minister is pushing ahead. He is trying to reform his government, which would allow him a few more months in office until autumn, until the time when the new leader of the Conservative Party is appointed. We're expecting that resignation statement from Boris Johnson in Number 10, probably around lunchtime. That's the latest we've been hearing, though, of course, on these days, things are always somewhat of a movable feast. And it does feel as though those appointments are now starting to be confirmed. Will he find enough people who are willing to serve under him as he tries to stay on as a caretaker leader in the months ahead? Well, we can discuss some of those issues in a bit more detail. We're joined now from Kent by the former Conservative advisor Claire Pearsall, and also from Bahrain, the former Labour advisor and economist James Medway. Thank you both for being with us. Claire, to you first. Do you think that Boris Johnson should be able to stay on as Prime Minister?
No, I don't. I think that we are in a really precarious position, and by him sort of holding on with the tips of his fingers to a job that he really should no longer have, it's just going to cause more chaos. And I think Adam laid it out really, really clearly just now by saying he's making it worse by appointing some kind of assembled cabinet. And at the moment, we've only seen one position being filled. And bear in mind, pretty much every single government department has substantial losses. I'm not sure he's going to find the rest of the cabinet members very easily. I just think he needs to make his statement. I think he needs to go, and we need to be able to move on from this very, very quickly.
OK, well, let's go across to James Medway, shall we? Former Labour advisor to the Shadow Chancellor, then Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell. Do you think that the Prime Minister should be able to stay on? I guess the argument from Number 10 would be to give that continuity and to allow him to really push ahead with some of the reforms at this important time?
No, I mean, there's going to be an agreement on this. No, he certainly should not stay on, but also, I mean, he shouldn't have been there in the first place. Anybody who's worked with him, there was an article from Max Hastings doing the rounds this morning from 3 years ago, his first editor, saying that Boris Johnson's essentially a serial liar, not to be trusted, not someone who should be in a position of responsibility. He should never have been there in the first place. The Conservative Party should never have appointed him. There shouldn't have been the belief promoted.
I'm just going to come in, if I may.
Particularly in 2019.
I'm just going to come in, if I may. You said that he should never have been there in the first place. I mean, he won an election, didn't he? He was elected with a very substantial majority. So I don't really understand what you're saying if he should never have been there in the first place.
No, look, this is me giving my straight-down-the-line political views on this. I don't agree with Boris Johnson. I don't think he should have been Prime Minister. I would have preferred if he didn't win the general election. I would have preferred if Labour had won that.
I'm just going to have to break you off again. Apologies. It's one of those very fast-moving mornings because we are hearing that James Cleverly has now been appointed as the Secretary of State for Education. You can see there the official announcement from 10 Downing Street on Twitter. James Cleverly, the new Secretary of State for Education, the third Secretary of State for Education in as many days, astonishingly. Let's bring in our political editor, Beth Rigby. Those appointments are now starting to roll in now, aren't they?
Yes,
Clark,
they are.
And now we've got James
So
Cleverly.
I'm just checking my phone because, yes, James Cleverly just officially confirmed. I've also been told that Rob Buckland, the former Justice Secretary, who was shuffled out in the last reshuffle by Boris Johnson, and he was, if you like, the last stand-in man of the One Nation cohort of the Conservative Party still in his cabinet. I'm told that he is going to be the Welsh Secretary, so he is replacing Simon Hart. So we have James Cleverly, Education Secretary, Robert Buckland, I think, will be announced soon as the Welsh Secretary. And who was the final one that we did? Greg Clark. Greg Clark as the new Levelling Up Secretary. And it's interesting, James Cleverly is a long-term ally of Boris Johnson's as well. He's been very close to him. He was demoted by Boris Johnson as well, but he now back in the cabinet. So that's three cabinet appointments. Clark to Levelling Up, Buckland, which hasn't been announced yet but respected, Welsh Secretary, and Cleverly to Education.
And how much do you think that this is shoring up Boris Johnson's position in the months ahead? Because obviously, you know, talking to Adam, talking to many of our guests this morning as well, they're saying that it's going to be difficult for him to stay on until the autumn. But how important is it for his survival until the autumn to get some of these posts filled quickly?
I really think that there's a more pressing issue than all of the politics around this at the moment, which is cabinet posts need filling because the Department of Education needs to be run for a start. You know, our kids go to school and those departments need secretaries of state that are accountable. So actually, you could argue it the other way, which is Boris Johnson feels, as still the Prime Minister, that it's his duty to fill those posts. But
although I guess if he did step down and allow Dominic Raab to take over, or whoever it would be, Theresa May, then that could be done as well.
Yeah, and what's happening now, as we've talked about, is within the party, there is a division about whether Boris Johnson should be allowed to stay on until October or September when the new leader is announced, or whether he should leave now. But in the interim, he is appointing people into a cabinet, and he wants to fill those posts.
OK, thank you very much, Beth. Always interesting to talk. So 3 positions there we understand being filled so far. Greg Clark levelling up, James Cleverly to education, and Beth just hearing there Robert Buckland also being brought back into the fold. Well, let's bring back in Adam Bolton, shall we, the former Sky News political editor and presenter. Beth just making the point there that perhaps the most pressing issue of all is to get these departments up and running as soon as possible. Department for Education, for example, are almost left completely bereft, not only of a Secretary of State, but also ministers too.
Well, it's certainly true that normal government business has ground to a halt, that Parliament has been unable to do its normal committee and consideration of bills because this Boris Johnson has been unable to field ministers, and so there have to be a lot of cancellations. It's also true that, for example, we've heard from Ben Wallace, currently the bookie's favourite to be the next leader of the Conservative Party, that he has only stayed on as Defence Secretary because he needs to do the job, just like Suella Braverman, the Attorney General, has said that, even although they think Boris Johnson should go. But bearing that in mind, appointments by Boris Johnson, who's already signalled he's going, I'm just not sure legally how binding the status of these cabinet appointments is, or whether they will hold. And as I say, that simply creates more damage. And it may be that Boris Johnson is making these appointments as his last act of Prime Minister, and then he is going to leave the stage altogether. But it's equally likely that possibly what he's trying to do is to appoint a cabinet which will be loyal to him through what he hopes will be a lengthy transition period, perhaps hoping that at the end of that he can somehow cling on to office. It's a really, really dangerous time for the British Constitution and British political governments.
OK, Adam, thank you very much indeed. Adam Bolton there for us. Well, let's go now to Parliament's Central Lobby, always the hub, I guess, in Westminster, where there was a steady flow of MPs. We can talk now to Deputy Political Editor Sam Coates. Sam, who have you been talking to?
Aaron Bell. Now, Aaron was one of the first people to come out against Boris Johnson back in January, possibly feeling somewhat vindicated by where so many colleagues are today. And he joins me now to digest some of the huge amounts of news we've had this morning. Where are we now? We have some of your colleagues going back into government to prop up Boris Johnson's regime, Boris Johnson wanting to go on maybe as long as October. Does any of that feel sustainable?
Morning, Sam. My preference, I think, would be to have a caretaker premiership. If Dominic Raab is not running for the leadership, and that's my understanding, but it might not be correct, he did a very good job while Boris was incapacitated with COVID, and I think that's what we need right now. We need a period of calm. You know, I have all the time in the world for the colleagues who've just gone back into government. They're all decent people who are serving their country, and as are some of the people who haven't resigned from government. They're there because people need to do those jobs, like Defence Secretary, like Home Secretary. But my preference would be that we have a caretaker Prime Minister for the summer.
Why? Why do you think Boris Johnson needs to go now?
Well, I'm concerned, as I said in the House this morning, that he won't be able to fill all the ministerial positions. And I think it's important that we have all those ministerial positions there. I also think the last 48 hours, his refusal to accept reality has done a lot of damage to trust in the institution as a whole, in Parliament, in the conventions that we have in the Conservative Party, that when the game's up, the game's up. And unfortunately, it took a long time for the Prime Minister to realise that. I'm glad he's come to his senses today. I think it's quite sad. I backed Boris Johnson in the first place. I voted Leave. He's delivered a lot for the country. He's done a huge job on Ukraine, even in the last few months while I've been opposing him. I think it's a sad day, but I think it would be better for the country if we had a caretaker Prime Minister.
Isn't it quite incredible that today, the day where Boris Johnson in the next few hours is going to announce he's leaving office, there's yet another battle to pull him out of office, not at the time of his choosing. What damage, what decisions are you worried that Boris Johnson might make if he is allowed to stay in place till October?
I think it's a question of propriety. He has lost the confidence of the party, that's absolutely apparent, and therefore it's not appropriate that we have anything other than a proper caretaker administration. Now, if we remember in the final days of the Theresa May administration, she made huge commitments. She put us on the path to net zero without any parliamentary vote. And, I support the aim of getting towards net zero, but there was no scrutiny of that. That was a last-minute decision. Something similar like that could happen under any administration. I think you need a definite caretaker. And I also can't see why it needs to take till October anyway. Assuming Boris Johnson's resigning as we expect this afternoon, I'm sure we can complete the parliamentary process to get down to 2 candidates before recess, and then the leadership going out to the party in the country should be quicker than before, because we now have centralised membership records, so it shouldn't take as long to organise the ballot as it did when Boris Johnson took over.
How can you get Boris Johnson out sooner than he wants to go? What mechanisms do you have? What techniques? I mean, could we end up with the people like James Cleverly and Greg Clark going back into government being urged by people like you to resign again?
Look, I think it has to be somewhat informal. It has to be, we've seen the shortcomings of that approach in the last 48 hours, I'll concede. But the mood of the party conveyed through the 1922 committee, and obviously we've got elections for that on Monday, which I'll be standing in, by the way, running for the executive. I do think that's my preference. Now, if it's not possible, then it's not possible. I mean, I'm not saying it's absolutely essential, but my preference would be to have a caretaker Prime Minister.
Aaron Bell, thank you very much indeed. That is where we are in the Conservative Party. Boris Johnson about to resign. Already the next conversation about when he'll actually leave firmly underway. Sophie.
Yeah, it certainly is firmly underway, isn't it, Sam? Well, we're expecting still that statement from Boris Johnson announcing his intention to resign around 1 p.m. It seems to have been pushed back slightly, but he's expected to be out on the street shortly. Just to bring in Beth very quickly.
Since you're on it, I've just been told that he's going to make the statement at 12:30. 35 minutes. The PM to make his statement. I've just been told that from someone in his team.
There you go. A bit of breaking news for you from Beth, our political editor there. 30 minutes to go, 35 minutes to go until that resignation statement from the Prime Minister. It's been a busy morning for him already. He's been filling some of those vacant posts in his cabinet. James Cleverly to Education, Kit Malthouse, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, Greg Clark to Levelling Up, Robert Buckland to Wells Secretary. Will it be enough for him to stay on in post until the autumn? That is the big question to be answered. Well, we might get a bit more of a flavour of that at 12:30 when that Prime Minister is expected. The Prime Minister is expected to give his statement here in Downing Street. Hello, welcome back to Sky News' coverage live from Downing Street, where in the next half an hour, the Prime Minister is expected to give a statement on this street announcing his resignation. At 12:30, we're expecting that statement from the Prime Minister. In the meantime, he's been busy filling some of the vacant roles in his cabinet as he seeks to buy a few more months in office before standing aside to allow a new leader to take his place. Well, we're joined on the street this morning by our political editor, Beth Rigby. And Beth, we're expecting that statement, aren't we, in around half an hour's time. What kind of tone do you think we might hear?
Yeah, so we've just been told that we will get that statement at 12:30. We thought it was going to be at 1 o'clock. It's now at 12:30. And as for the tone, I've been told by some of the people that have been around the Prime Minister in the past 12 hours that he was very amicable with cabinet ministers going in to give him the bad news last night, and that he has been upbeat this morning. So let's see what tone he strikes. Knowing Boris Johnson a bit, having interviewed him a few times and watched him in press conferences and watched him at these big moments, I think he'll want to do two things. I think he'll want to view it as an address to the nation, like he did in the pandemic. So I think he will want to be statesman-like, but I also think he will want to use it as an opportunity to run through some of his greatest hits. He will talk about Brexit. He will talk, I have no doubt, about the vaccine rollout. I would put money on that, actually, so we could do a wager later. And I think he will talk about the huge mandate that he was given back in 2019. And probably he will talk about the regret that he feels that he has to stand aside. But when I think back to the last time I was here, and it was Theresa May resigning, and she resigned, and then Boris Johnson came from the palace up the street. It was the most extraordinary of days, and she broke, actually, when she... I remember it very distinctly. She said, "It has been the greatest privilege of my life to serve the country I love." And it stuck in my mind. I didn't even have to check it. Normally I have to check every quote. I forget them. But her voice broke as she said, "the country I love," and she went back in. I don't imagine that I will see Boris Johnson shedding a tear, but he might find it a very emotional moment. You have to remember, Sophie, he didn't want to go.
Yeah, this is it, isn't it? He has been almost dragged to this position, and it has been right at the last moment when he simply didn't have a cabinet left that I guess he was forced to accept the inevitable. It was interesting hearing you talk about the memories that you have.
Oh, sorry, I've got a break in line here. Just to tell you that Kit Malthouse, as we were talking about earlier, the policing minister, has been appointed the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, so he is going to the Cabinet Office. So that was the post. Michael Gove had it, then he went to Levelling Up. Then Steve Barclay had that position, and then he straddled that between the Cabinet Office and the Chief of Staff. Anyway, I've been told that Kit Malthouse is going to be the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster.
There you go. The positions starting to really fill up there, as you can say. Kit Malthouse, Duchy of Lancaster. We've had the Education Secretary, the Wales Secretary of State for Wales, the Levelling Up Secretary position filled. A busy morning for Boris Johnson.
Yeah, and the very excellent Steve Swinford, who's the political editor of The Times, is also reporting that there's going to be a cabinet meeting apparently at 3 p.m. I'm just trying to get that confirmed. But, I mean, what an extraordinary day that we have all of this, and then Boris Johnson holds a cabinet meeting with his new cabinet. I haven't got that confirmed, I should say, but Steve Swinford is normally, as you know, on the money.
Yeah, he certainly is. And it does feel, doesn't it, that if that is the case, then he must be pretty confident that he's going to have a full cabinet by 3 p.m.
No, well,
in order to do it.
I mean, Nadeem Zahawi publicly said to the Prime Minister this morning, "You need to go," but he didn't actually resign.
And Suella Braverman as well.
Yeah, and that happened actually with a few cabinet ministers. You know, Kit Malthouse didn't resign, but he told him he had to go. Priti Patel didn't resign, but she told him he had to go. Nadeem Zahawi publicly said he had to go. Michael Gove privately told him that he was going to resign if he didn't go, and Boris Johnson sacked him before Michael Gove got his moment to resign. So a number of them didn't resign but wanted him to go. So he's got Nadeem Zahawi still in post as Chancellor, and now he's filled those gaps. So the Welsh Secretary is going to be Robert Buckland. The Levelling Up Secretary, that was Michael Gove, is going to be Greg Clark. Education Secretary is Michelle Donnellan. She was only just appointed and then she resigned. That's going to be his old ally, James Cleverly, and we've just been told Kit Malthouse is going to be the Duchy of Lancaster.
Yeah, another old ally for the Prime Minister. It's interesting as well, Beth, isn't it? I was just reflecting when you were talking about the Theresa May resignation statement and the emotion that you felt there. And, you kind of cast your mind further back as well. David Cameron, who obviously stepped aside after the referendum vote. Gordon Brown, bringing his kind of family out to join him as well. And you do get the sense, don't you, that it could be a very different statement from the Prime Minister, who is already appointing a new cabinet for him to kind of push ahead for the months ahead.
Well, I think Boris Johnson, David Cameron had to go because he lost the referendum. Theresa May didn't want to go, but she was forced out, not in a dissimilar way to what's happening to Boris Johnson, in that she won a confidence vote, but then there was still agitation, and 6 months later was her moment when she got the tap on the shoulder from Sir Graham Brady and was told that it was time for her to go, and she just walked. She didn't have all the drama that Boris Johnson has had. But Boris Johnson now is in a similar position. A confidence vote he won, but the party was immovable. His cabinet telling him to go, and he found himself in a position where he's got to resign.
Well, as we've been talking there the last few minutes, me and Beth, there has been a bit of movement on Downing Street, which is probably what you would expect, given it's now, just looking at the clock at the bottom of the screen, just over 20 minutes until the Prime Minister's statement. We've had people coming out at both number 10 and number 11, some kind of wires, cables, some of the kind of structures around the statement being brought out. So it does feel that, the level of activity here on Downing Street has always been pretty lively this morning, to say the least, but we're seeing a stepping up as everyone on the street starts to get ready to hear what Boris Johnson does have to say at 12:30. And as Beth was just saying, the tone of it, I think, will be very interesting indeed. We know he's going to resign. We know he's going to set a timetable for stepping down. It's the position that he didn't want to be in. But at the same time, he is busy appointing people to his cabinet. We've had appointments this morning. The reports from the Times that there's going to be a cabinet meeting at 3 p.m. So lots of activity going ahead. Let's bring in Adam Bolton at this point, shall we? The former Sky News political editor and presenter. And Adam, Beth was just reflecting on some of the statements that we've heard over the years from departing prime ministers. How do you think Boris Johnson's speech will differ from some of the other ones that you covered in your time?
I think we're going to have to listen very carefully to what Boris Johnson says, not just for the emotion of it, but actually the content, what claims he makes about when he's going to resign, how long he plans to carry on, and also what this cabinet he's now appointed really means. And if he comes out and he tends to be defiant in these circumstances, we saw him yesterday at the liaison committee, and says that he's going to govern strongly as long as he's there as a caretaker, I think that will be very controversial, and it's not sure it's going to stand. There are two theories, really, about what's going on with the appointment of the cabinet. One is spite, to keep out the resignees. The other is that he's appointing a moderate transition cabinet. But we can go now to the Institute for Government, where Theresa May is giving the Brokenshire lecture on political governance. It'll be very interesting to hear what the former Prime Minister has to say.
And I would also like to thank Cathy Brokenshire, Jeremy White, Chloe Smith and the Institute for Government for the work in establishing the lecture. It is, I believe, a fitting and lasting memorial to James, who was not just a valued and trusted colleague, but also a wonderful friend. And I can think of no better place to give this lecture than here at the Institute for Government. This is an organisation dedicated to making government more effective. Dare I say it, effective government needs effective ministers. And I can think of no more effective minister than the late James Brokenshire. James joined the Home Office as one of my junior ministers, already highly knowledgeable on home affairs, having shadowed the brief for 4 years. He served first as Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for Crime Reduction, then for Crime and Security, then as Minister for State for both security and immigration, grappling at once with two of the most important and complex areas of policy. In fact, I recall the then Permanent Secretary remarking that as James was responsible for 2/3 of Home Office business, what on earth were the other ministers going to do? On becoming Prime Minister, I appointed James to the Cabinet as Secretary of State for Northern Ireland and subsequently as Secretary of State for Housing, Communities and Local Government. And he was, of course, later reappointed to the Home Office as Minister of State for Security under the new government. James was respected by all those he worked with, and civil servants liked working with him. He took the time to understand the issues, thought carefully about them, and would challenge officials when necessary. But they always knew that the challenge came because he wanted the policy to work. He wanted government to be effective. He was always respectful of officials, understanding that good government requires politicians and civil servants to work together as a team, everyone determined to provide the best practical solution for the public we all serve. When thinking about James and why he was so effective, 3 elements come to mind, and it's these 3 that I want to develop in this lecture as I address this issue of restoring faith in politics. And those 3 elements are, firstly, that he was a good constituency MP, recognising that it is in the constituency that we can see the impact of policy. Secondly, James respected Parliament, understanding the importance of the scrutiny that Parliament provides. He accepted both that Parliament can improve legislation and that sometimes there has to be compromise in order to get legislation through. Another element of this was his willingness to work across the House to find solutions. This came most naturally in relation to his work as Security Minister, but in other areas too, he would take the time and trouble to speak to his opposite numbers. And thirdly, he knew that ministers have to get to grips with the issues. It isn't good enough just to wing it or prioritise getting the headlines. An effective minister takes the time and trouble to really get into the detail of the issue. James was a dependable, safe pair of hands, and I always had confidence in him. But when I look back at the sort of man he was, James wasn't merely competent. He was unmistakably somebody with deep-rooted values. He exemplified decency, honesty, and integrity, values that I believe are essential in public life if we are to have faith in our politics. As was remarked at his memorial service, James came into politics to serve, not to be served. I have said before that Parliament is the worse off without James. I would also say that our politics and Parliament would be more likely to be trusted by the public if there were more politicians who clearly showed they shared James's values. Public service was perhaps James's strongest motivation. He was a consummate member of Parliament. He knew that his increasingly successful ministerial career was only possible because his constituents had sent him to Parliament on their behalf. And he didn't just represent their views, he was deeply embedded within the local community. He brought people together and through service to his constituents earned their respect. In our modern representative democracy, it's no longer enough simply to turn up at Parliament and shuffle through the voting lobbies. The public rightly expect us to be fighting their corner, taking up their concerns, visible in the community, and working for them on local issues and interests. They expect us to be making a tangible difference to their everyday lives. This was a concept often misunderstood by fellow ministers internationally. I particularly remember one of my opposite numbers when I was Home Secretary remarking on the peculiar arrangement in the UK of being both a minister and an MP and asking what it was like. I replied, put it this way, today I am at this international summit discussing counter-terrorism. Tomorrow I will open a community vegetable garden. While these seemingly frivolous constituency engagements might not have the glamour of international summits, they've always been just as important to me, and I know that was a view shared by James Brokenshire too. I spoke on my last appearance at the Dispatch Box as Prime Minister about the vital link between every single member of the House and the constituencies we represent. I called it the bedrock of our parliamentary democracy and our liberty, because without strong relationships with the communities we serve, how can we expect to build faith in our politics as a whole? The strong relationship James had with his local community is particularly inspiring at a time when trust in politicians has been eroded. A recent YouGov poll for the IPPR found that 63% of people believe their politicians are merely out for themselves. More shockingly, 5%, just 1 in 20 people, believe that MPs are in it for the interests of their country. A recent poll for Carnegie UK found that over 3/4 of the population don't trust MPs very much or at all. Now, distrust in politics is not a new issue. We were asking the same questions of the public 80 years ago. The difference is, when asked in 1944, just 35% of the population agreed that politicians were out for themselves, compared to 2/3 of people today. The Carnegie survey also identified 9 values often thought of as being desirable in public life and asked people which they felt was most important. Almost half of the representative sample chose honesty and integrity. By contrast, fewer than 5% of people prioritised other values, including individual liberty and strength and security. Of those who most valued honesty and integrity, only 8% agreed the government has this value. The figures make for sobering reading. But they demonstrate that if we are to accommodate voters' priorities, we ought to be placing at least as much, if not more, emphasis on improving honesty and integrity in public life as we do in other areas of public policy. Those of us engaged in politics must grasp just how significantly the electorate feel their expectations are not being met. One of the fundamental expectations of the people we represent is that we play by the rules. No double standards, no taking advantage of the position one holds. It's that inherently British sense of fair play, originally popularised, of course, through our nation's greatest sport, cricket. A game that, in a time of empire, inequality and class divide, brought together aristocrats and labourers on an equal footing under one set of rules. In cricket, it's not enough to avoid breaking the rules. In fact, the game requires adherence to its traditions as much as its laws. Law 41. The captains are responsible for ensuring that play is conducted within the spirit of cricket as well as within the laws. Respect is essential. Respect of one's teammates, the opposition, and the authority of the umpire. And players must create a positive atmosphere by their own conduct and encourage others to do likewise. For any action which is seen to abuse this spirit causes injury to the game itself. I take the same view of politics. Breaking the rules and breaking the spirit of the rules causes injury to the standing of our democracy. In politics, of course, playing by the rules means following the law, and it's not unreasonable to expect those of us who write the law of the land to follow its letter and spirit. It also means adhering to the rule of law, the doctrine that all people and institutions, including the state itself, are accountable under the law as it stands. It protects the liberty of the individual against the arbitrary use of power. It underpins political and economic stability and our standing in the wider world. And as I've said before, we cannot claim as a country to operate in line with the rule of law if we flagrantly abuse our own obligations under treaties we have signed. Playing by the rules also means not changing them on a whim to suit short-term or personal interests. The government's decision back in November to attempt to change the rules on parliamentary standards was ill-judged and wrong. It is right the ministers have since apologised, but the episode did little to improve faith in our politics and spelled the beginning of an unhappy period for the government and for our public life. Playing by the rules means following them not because you have to, but because you do so willingly, recognising that the damage from breaking them may not be direct or immediate, but it can be severe and lasting. It's the spirit of cricket again. It's especially pertinent in our constitutional system, where adherence to convention is an important element of our democracy. The flexibility afforded by our uncodified constitution has served us well over centuries. By and large, its slow evolution has enabled it to meet the requirements of the day, where other countries have found themselves caught in a legal straitjacket. But our system only works if conventions are not cast aside wholesale, or at least not willfully misinterpreted. It rests on those in positions of authority being trusted to uphold the values and traditions of our public life. Now, of course, in our parliamentary system, the role that exemplifies that the most is the Speaker of the House of Commons, the one person above all others who is expected to be neutral in their work. The practical exercisable power held by the Speaker to shape public debate and the work of our legislature is often underreported. The workings of the House are determined officially by the standing orders, but the interpretation and application of those orders is entirely within the hands of the Speaker. In areas where the standing orders are not clear, we consult works of authority such as Erskine May and adhere to proven historical conventions. Long-standing practices like the government of the day determining the business of the House or the proper use of a humble address, which until 2017 had not been used substantively since 1866. On that occasion, 2017, the Labour Party leadership sought to disregard the long-standing conventions of our legislature for short-term political gain. In doing so, breaking another of our most fundamental practices in not seeking to involve the monarch in our political debate. If we depart from the spirit of our established constitutional rules to suit short-term interests, we undermine faith in our system. Another well-known convention of the House of Commons, of course, is the way we refer to fellow parliamentarians. We are all, in the House at least, honourable members. Convention dictates that we don't address one another, instead pose our questions and responses to the chair. Convention prevents us from calling one another liars and traitors. For over 150 years, these practices, admittedly perhaps odd-sounding to the outside world, have helped to make the cut and thrust of debate less personal and direct, and have helped in a small way to maintain the dignity of the House and the honour of its members. Because politics is an honourable pursuit. And in my experience of over 30 years in public life, the vast majority of those who seek political office are motivated to improve the lives of others and fight for what they believe to be.
Theresa May there speaking at the Institute for Government. You can see there, let me just get out of the way of the picture, you can see there the lectern, the podium in front of the door of number 10, outside number 11. Staff serving the Prime Minister have been gathering, waiting to hear the statement that we're expecting in the next 10 minutes or so. Andrew Griffith, for example, we can see standing there, the Prime Minister's Director of Policy, and other members of the staff there standing outside at number 11, gathering to hear the resignation statement of the Prime Minister, expected at 12:30. They're currently plugging in the podium outside number 10.
So this is what traditionally happens when a Prime Minister stands down. You can see on your screen there's James Duddridge in the middle with a brightly coloured tie. To his right is Andrew Griffiths. He was the Prime Minister's policy chief. He used to be the chief financial officer, actually, at Sky PLC. Behind Andrew Griffith, you can see Geeta Hari. He's the Prime Minister's Director of Communications. And I'm wondering, too, whether Carrie Johnson might come out. I remember when the Prime Minister was appointed to the post that she stood there with members of staff. If we look down the other side of the street, I don't think you can see this, but there are MPs also gathering. Now, I don't know if we can flip the camera around, but there, I can see Conor Burns, one of the Prime Minister's oldest allies. I don't know if you can see, there's people in the way, but yes, there you go. You can see Robert Peston there, and ITV, all the crews along the street, but you can see there MPs, and there was some talk this morning that the number 10 team had asked for MPs to come behind Boris Johnson when he comes out, and some of them are gathering there. Not a huge group, I have to say, but there they all are. I think is that Heather Wheeler at the front, Sophie,
I think it is
in the white
jacket,
embracing some of her colleagues.
You can see her embracing some people there. As you say, Johnny Mercer, I can also just glimpse behind that lamppost.
There's Alan Mack there, who is, I think, a whip. I don't know all of their names actually, but there you've got
some Daniel Korinsky and Peter Brown also there. As you say, Beth, not perhaps the largest grouping of MPs ever, but certainly it does feel like that edict has gone out from number 10, that more supportive MPs should come to the streets ready to hear the Prime Minister's statement. So what we have here is outside the door of number 11, the members of staff at number 10 and number 11 coming out to hear. And the other end of the street is the gathering of MPs as well. So everyone really getting ready here. The last check's been made to the podium. They are getting those wires ready to hear from Boris Johnson. It's a speech that he didn't want to have to make. We are expecting him to come out of that door shortly to give the resignation statement that he's been resisting for the last few days. But it will be, we expect, very different in tone to resignation speeches of the past. He's determined to keep going on in the role as the kind of caretaker leader, if you like, after setting out a timetable for his resignation for some months, until the autumn, he says, until the next person is appointed. Beth.
If you just can pan over to there's just been a run of new people now coming out, all of the number 10 team now coming out, filling up the street, and I can see there his communications trees. There's Rosie Bates-Williams, there's Steph Liz. You can see, if you move to number 11, at the end you can see now his comms team have come out, all his senior members of staff, they're now waiting, and you can see the street has moved. The lady in the floral dress like behind Simone Finn, Baroness Finn, one of his key advisors, and was once actually an advisor, do you remember, to Michael Gove. She's there, one of his, I think she's a deputy chief of staff. So the Boris Johnson's team now all out there as we await for the Prime Minister. I have to say though, Sophie, in terms of the appeal to get MPs out, there's not a massive group of MPs there, is there?
There isn't, certainly. And I think we should be able to hopefully have a look at some of the MPs who are gathered there. And as you say, Beth, to be honest, if it is true, which it seems like it was, that number 10 have made the appeal for MPs to...
Sorry, Cameron,
made the MPs trying to get to have a look at the MPs who've gathered. As Beth was just saying, as number 10 made the appeal for the supportive MPs to come to the street to show their support for Boris Johnson. That is not a great number of MPs who have actually answered that call. A few people that we've managed to spot: Conor Burns, Alan Mack, Heather Wheeler, Peter Bone, Daniel Korinsky, but clearly that is not a huge number of MPs, and perhaps suggesting there that even though the MPs have answered Boris Johnson's call, and he has managed to refill his cabinet.
The audio. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Good stuff.
I mean, looking at that, I don't know how many MPs would you say there? 30, 40?
I reckon about 30.
I mean, for a Prime Minister that 2.5 years ago won a majority of 80, the most successful Conservative leader at the ballot box since Margaret Thatcher, totally crushing David Cameron at the ballot box at least, and really that isn't a massive group of MPs here today, given how many opened their seats to him back in 2019. But I think it reflects, Sophie, the bitterness between this Prime Minister and his parliamentary party. I was saying yesterday in the Commons, it was visceral, it was vicious. It gets like that towards the end because for Boris Johnson, he was in the fight for his political life. And when you get to the end game like that, it gets nasty. And it really did deteriorate the atmosphere. And obviously a number of MPs have thought, no, I'm not going to come along and stand behind you. I think the MPs might be come and stand behind him. I guess he would like that as a show of strength, but let's see what they do.
It's interesting, isn't it, though, because if it is intended as a show of strength, which you have to assume it is, He can only muster up about 30 MPs. You do have to wonder if that was perhaps the share of strength that was intended.
Yeah.
Jacob Rees-Mogg and Johnny Mercer, we can now see coming out of the
Jolly on, if you
move
move back, I'm sorry, the poor cameraman. Can you move? We're trying to show you. Sorry, let me talk to you about it as the camera moves over.
We can now hopefully cut to the shots outside number 11.
Sorry, we interrupted. So Jacob Rees-Mogg, one of the Prime Minister's key lieutenants, there he is. You can see him. He's come out of number 11. Let's see if he'll give us a wave. No, he's not.
From the lectern.
And Johnny Mercer actually is that. And that's Chris Heaton-Harris. He is the chief whip. And that's Nigel Adams, one of Prime Minister's key. And here is Carrie Johnson and the baby, Romy, her 9-month-old. They just came on the trip to Chogham with us, actually. It was lovely. I got a little sight of that lovely baby. There is Carrie Johnson, and next to her, Nadine Dorries, the Prime Minister's closest ally. And look, there's the little baby. And I don't know where Wilf is. They've got a toddler as well.
I mean, to be honest, probably quite risky having a toddler out on the Downing Street.
Well, the toddler did not come on the trip, which, as anyone knows who takes a toddler on a plane, is probably best advised. So look, there we have it. Chris Heaton-Harris, there's Carrie. There's giving us a little wave. She looks actually lovely, doesn't she, in that red dress? And the little baby, Romney, there she is. She's a sweet little baby. She's only 9 months old. And Nadine Dorries. And we are waiting for the Prime Minister. The door is opening. Here he comes. Let's listen in.
Everybody. Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you. It is clearly now the will of the Parliamentary Conservative Party that there should be a new leader of that party and therefore a new Prime Minister. And I've agreed with Sir Graham Brady, the chairman of our backbench MPs, that the process of choosing that new leader should begin now. And the timetable will be announced next week. And I've today appointed a cabinet to serve, as I will, until a new leader is in place. So I want to say to the millions of people who voted for us in 2019, many of them voting Conservative for the first time, thank you for that incredible mandate, the biggest Conservative majority since 1987, the biggest share of the vote since 1979. And the reason I have fought so hard in the last few days to continue to deliver that mandate in person was not just because I wanted to do so, but because I felt it was my job, my duty, my obligation to you to continue to do what we promised in 2019. And of course, I'm immensely proud of the achievements of this government, from getting Brexit done to settling our relations with the continent for over half a century, reclaiming the power for this country to make its own laws in Parliament, getting us all through the pandemic, delivering the fastest vaccine rollout in Europe, the fastest exit from lockdown, and in the last few months, leading the West in standing up to Putin's aggression in Ukraine. And let me say now to the people of Ukraine that I know that we in the UK will continue to back your fight for freedom for as long as it takes. And at the same time, in this country, we've been pushing forward a vast programme of investment in infrastructure and skills and technology, the biggest in a century, because if I have one insight into human beings, it is that genius and talent and enthusiasm and imagination are evenly distributed throughout the population, but opportunity is not. And that's why we must keep levelling up, keep unleashing the potential of every part of the United Kingdom. And if we can do that in this country, we will be the most prosperous in Europe. And in the last few days, I've tried to persuade my colleagues that it would be eccentric to change governments when we're delivering so much and when we have such a vast mandate and when we're actually only a handful of points behind in the polls, even in mid-term after quite a few months of pretty relentless sledging, and when the economic scene is so difficult domestically and internationally. And I regret not to have been successful in those arguments, and of course it's painful not to be able to see through so many ideas and projects myself. But as we've seen at Westminster, the herd instinct is powerful. When the herd moves, it moves. And my friends, in politics, no one is remotely indispensable. And our brilliant and Darwinian system will produce another leader equally committed to taking this country forward through tough times, not just helping families to get through it, but changing and improving the way we do things, cutting burdens on businesses and families, and yes, cutting taxes, because that is the way to generate the growth and the income we need to pay for great public services. And to that new leader, I say, whoever he or she may be, I say I will give you as much support as I can. And to you, the British public, I know that there will be many people who are relieved, and perhaps quite a few who will also be disappointed. And I want you to know how sad I am to be giving up the best job in the world. But them's the breaks. I want to thank Carrie and our children and all the members of my family who have had to put up with so much for so long. I want to thank the peerless British Civil Service for all the help and support that you have given our police, our emergency services, and of course, our fantastic NHS, who at critical moment helped to extend my own period in office, as well as our armed services and our agencies that are so admired around the world, and our indefatigable Conservative Party members and supporters, whose selfless campaigning makes our democracy possible. I want to thank the wonderful staff here at Chequers, here at Number 10, and of course at Chequers, and our fantastic prop force detectives, the one group, by the way, who never leak. Above all, I want to thank you, the British public, for the immense privilege that you have given me. And I want you to know that from now on until the new Prime Minister is in place, your interests will be served and the government of the country will be carried on. Being Prime Minister is an education in itself. I've travelled to every part of the United Kingdom, and in addition to the beauty of our natural world, I found so many people possessed of such boundless British originality and so willing to tackle old problems in new ways that I know that even if things can sometimes seem dark now, our future together is golden. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Boris Johnson there talking about how sad he is to give up the best job in the world, but them's the breaks. Thank you for an incredible mandate, he said to the people who gave him the mandate after that 2019 general election victory. But the Darwinian system, he said, will now produce a new leader. Let's go to Beth Rigby, shall we? Beth, what did you make of that statement?
Well, it was kind of trademark, but it was vintage Boris Johnson, wasn't it? It was, as I thought it would be. He was talking about his greatest hits. It had humour in there. It was tinged with sadness. And it was also very dignified, actually. A very dignified speech, I thought, in which he held his head high. He accepted that he didn't want to leave. And he gave, well, one thing about Boris Johnson is he doesn't really give you much emotion, but there, what he does is he uses language to show the emotion. And some of the things that, struck me, he said, of course, it was painful not to be able to see through the project. And as I said before, he rolled out the greatest hits. He said how proud he was to have got Brexit done. He said, and to give the country back the power to make its own laws. That's how he put it. He talked about levelling up. We must keep on levelling up, and we must fight for the freedom of Ukraine for as long as it takes. He then went on to say, of course, it is painful not to see the projects through that I wanted to. And then he said in a characteristically humorous way. He said, but the herd has moved, and when the herd moves, it moves quickly. And then he said, no one is remotely indispensable. He'd said how much he wanted to stay on, and then he said that the Darwinian system, as he put it, will produce another leader who he said he would give as much support as he could. And then he touched upon his divisiveness, because he's batted it off all the time. But he said, I know that some of you, many of you, he said, will be relieved and some disappointed by my resignation. And he said he was so sad to be leaving the best job in the world, as he described it. And then he finished off by thanking the public for giving him, as he said, the immense privilege of being able to serve as the Prime Minister. He said being Prime Minister is an education in itself. And he said about the boundless British energy and enthusiasm that he had met around the country. And then he finally ended with, you know, he is a journalist, he's a good writer, and he does good oratory. He said, it might feel dark now, but the future together is golden. And with that, the applause, there were no tears, massive applause. And he went back and he also thanked his wife, Carrie Johnson, who was watching on with their 9-month-old baby, Romney.
Yeah, it was, I thought, Beth, it was interesting talking beforehand about the emotion of other resignation statements we've seen. And in recent days, we've been told that Boris Johnson is in buoyant spirits. And you know, there were no tears, obviously, from the Prime Minister, but I did get a sense we got a flicker of emotion from him, perhaps more than he usually shows, when he was talking about how sad he was to give up the best job in the world, as she was saying, talking quite frankly about the reason that he's continued to fight on so long, perhaps a little bit of an acknowledgement that he has been trying to hang on to the job until it just became impossible.
Yeah, and you know, and he talked about, you know, he started off by thanking the British people for that huge mandate. He wanted it to be known that he was a winner once, and he won the biggest majority since Margaret Thatcher, and he wanted to remind everyone of that. And he explained that that was the reason that he clung on for so long, that he felt that he had been given a mandate by the people, and that mandate he felt stood, but he said, as he acknowledged, the herd moved against him. And once that happened, there really was nowhere else for him to go. But, you know, I didn't expect to see Boris Johnson shed a tear. The most emotion I've ever seen in Boris Johnson is him sometimes drops his head. But he wanted that to be a moment where he projected confidence and optimism. They are the tickets, if you like, that attracted the public to him in the first place, the can-do optimism, the Boris Johnson boosterism, as we used to call it. And really that speech, I think, had bucket loads of that in terms of the delivery. But also, look, it's hard to hear any Prime Minister talk about having to leave that job. It was hard to hear David Cameron do it, Theresa May, Boris Johnson, because, you know, as he said, it's the best job in the world. I'm sad to leave it. I didn't want to go, but I had to leave. And that must be absolutely brutal to have to do that in the moment. But, you know, he was very composed. He was upbeat, and I did, as I said, I felt that was vintage Boris Johnson. He gave us his best version of himself there.
Yes, certainly. You can see around us.
Oh,
they are literally packing up at our feet.
I think, yeah, we are being packed up.
I mean, this is the brutality of politics, I think. You know, he comes out there for the big moment,
should give us
and
a
then
wave for the camera.
You can see very quickly things are getting let
Yeah,
up.
the guys. So all the cables were running along here, and now it's all been packed up.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you so much for your analysis, Beth Rigby there, political editor. Well, that is it. We hear, of course, the speech from Boris Johnson, the resignation speech, where he spoke about he ran through his greatest hits, that, of course, a big majority, but also expressed his frustration in not being able to really follow through on some of the mandate that he was given in terms of big policies. We can bring in Adam Bolton now, the former Sky News political editor and presenter, to discuss a bit of that. And I don't know if you agree, Adam, detect a tinge of regret in the Boris Johnson speech, saying we must keep levelling up, that it was frustrating not to be able to continue in the work that he'd started. And it really has been a premiership marked by outside events, COVID, the war in Ukraine. Do you think that will be a sense of something that Boris Johnson, I guess, will regret looking back on his legacy?
Well, I'll leave aside the emotion, if I may. The fact is, this is a massive political humiliation for Boris Johnson, who won a great general election victory, or led his party to a great general election victory, but as he admitted, lost the confidence of his own party within the space of 2 years since that general election. I think what's more important, really, is trying to work out what's going to happen now. Boris Johnson, he didn't actually use the words, "I resign," but he's clearly on the way out. And let's look at his words. He said, "I have today appointed a cabinet to serve as I will until a new leader is in place." And he also said that the parliamentary party, the 1922 committee, will announce a timetable next week. Now, that holds open the possibility that if they go through the full leadership election process of MPs choosing 2 candidates and then those candidates being voted on by the Conservative Party, that he could actually have quite a long caretaker period as he sees it. Of course, the alternative, and maybe he's put the ball back into the parliamentary party, is that the MPs here, come up with one candidate who would effectively take over before the end of the month. Now, we saw this before with the transition to Theresa May and in opposition to Michael Howard. Now, if that happens, then we could have a very, very short transition period for both Mr. Johnson and this cabinet. But again, he's not making it easier for anyone else. Yeah, I mean, he's been in office. He highlighted the things that happened in office. There will be disputes as to how well the government handled the COVID crisis, for example. There will be disputes about whether Brexit has indeed been done. And there will also be disagreements as to whether in other areas of policy Mr. Johnson has achieved very much at all. But the fact of the matter is, he is now out. He will be going at the very latest by this October and the next party conference. And as Enoch Powell famously said, all political careers end in failure.
Or they certainly do, don't they, Adam? Adam, thank you very much for guiding us through some of the likely consequences now that Boris Johnson has set out a timetable for resigning as the leader of the Conservative Party and also as Prime Minister. I guess the question, of course, many are asking is whether or not he can continue until the autumn. We've seen Liz Truss on Twitter in the last few moments saying the Prime Minister has made the right decision. The government under Boris's leadership had many achievements, delivering Brexit, vaccines and back in Ukraine. We need calmness and unity now, she says, and to keep governing, that's the critical bit, while a new leader is found. Meanwhile, another MP texts me to say he's just tried to gaslight the party, utter narcissism to the end. So I think that certainly gives you a bit of a sense of the range of reactions of MPs to that speech by Boris Johnson and potential difficulties, I guess, in uniting the party even in the months ahead. Well, let's bring in our Deputy Political Editor now, shall we, Sam Cates, who's in Parliament's Central Lobby. Sam, we've been talking to MPs. What's the reaction?
That's right, Sophie. So, yes, a very striking, very important moment, constitutional moment. Boris Johnson signals that he will stand down, but only when there is a new Conservative Party leader to take over from him. An interim cabinet, as it were, will steward the country up until that point. What do MPs make of it? Will that position hold? Well, let's get the first reaction from a Tory MP. I'm joined by Jonathan Gullis, who called for Boris Johnson to go a couple of days ago, having previously been a staunch supporter. What did you make of the speech?
I thought it was moving. It was difficult to watch, to be honest with you, Sam. Look, as you say, up until recently, I've been very loyal to the Prime Minister because I believe he is instinctively a good man. And I'm grateful for all he did for Stoke-on-Trent with the 56 million from the Levelling Up Fund, 17.6 million Kidsgrove Town deal, 31 million to Bus Back Better and 500 new Home Office jobs. This is a man who understood where Stoke-on-Trent, North Kidsgrove and Torque was. It's where he's invested. It's where he's made sure that he delivered on that Brexit delay that had been happening. So it was difficult to see, but I sadly came to the conclusion, as you say, a number of days ago, that this simply was untenable, and it's painful to watch, but it's the right thing that he's gone.
He called it eccentric for the party to kick him out. There wasn't much thanks from him to the Conservative Party for what they've done. Was there any twinge of guilt, any twinge of regret when you watched that speech?
When I made that decision to resign as a parliamentary private secretary, which I appreciate is at the very bottom of the ladder in terms of ministerial roles, I knew that once I made that decision, that it was the right decision. I haven't regretted it once. I'm just sad that it came to this, because I think he is, as I say, a good person instinctively, and I think that he could have been and should have been a great Prime Minister, but sadly, just some poor choices over too long a time. They just meant that his position was untenable.
There is a very big live argument going on at the moment about whether or not Boris Johnson should be allowed to continue under the timetable that he wants, which is possibly some weeks, if not months, until the next Conservative Party leader and hence Prime Minister is chosen. Now, that could be September or October. Do you think Boris Johnson should stay in Downing Street until then?
My personal preference would have been, because of especially the last 24 hours and the scenes that we've seen since then, that Boris would have gone entirely, and we would have installed Dominic Raab as an interim Prime Minister, and then with the interim cabinet until we had a new leader. However, I trust Sir Graham Brady to act on the behalf of backbenchers. I trust the interim cabinet. There are very good people, so Robert Buckland, who I don't believe would have gone in there had they not known that they feel that they would be making sure that there were firm checks and balances on Boris whilst he continues, obviously, as you say, until we elect a new leader. So if that's what the senior members of the party have felt that they can live with, and that government will, most importantly, function and continue to deliver, especially for the people that I'm proud to represent, then I can live with that.
Do you think that's to settle with the Conservative Party as far as it's possible to judge, because we've only had this speech in a few minutes? Do you think colleagues will accept that timetable? Or, as you say, given the events of the last 36, 48 hours, do you think that there will continue to be a debate on that matter?
There probably will be a small debate on that matter, but I think we have to just bring a closure. We don't need to keep having rows internally. We now need to focus on making sure that we get a timetable in place to elect a new leader, that new leader get installed as soon as possible with their cabinet, and that we then get, most importantly, back on top of delivering for the people and focusing on the big issues of the day.
It's quite a wide-ranging cabinet from different wings of the party, clearly, to steward through this difficult time. But do you think there should be limits on what the government over the next few weeks and months while Boris Johnson is still there, effectively as a caretaker, should be able to do? Can Boris Johnson make some of the decisions he would have made anyway, or should he just try and run as steady, a low profile, as unambitious a ship as possible, because those will be matters for the next Prime Minister?
The Prime Minister, as he still is, Boris Johnson, was elected on a Conservative manifesto. We should be delivering that manifesto. So anything within that, absolutely, we should be focusing on. And also, internationally, we can't suddenly stop helping our friends in Ukraine. The Northern Ireland Protocol is something that clearly needs solving, and that Boris and the Cabinet agreed to. So with issues like that, we should be absolutely going hell for leather on.
But there is a debate in Number 10 about whether or not to push the button on a packet of tax cuts, changing economic direction. Are those the kind of decisions you want to see with Boris Johnson still in charge?
I trust that the Cabinet, as it now is, will come round the table, look at the situation. We have a global crisis when it comes to inflation. We're seeing energy bills rising. Constituents in my area are clearly worried, particularly about October. If it looks like we need to take action sooner rather than later, then yes, I would be supportive of any action that needs to be taken to protect households with their incomes, but also with the rising cost of food and energy. What if there are big issues like the Northern Ireland Protocol that could be up for debate in the leadership contest? Do you think that the party should just press on with that bill despite the international ire, difficult conversations, Europe not really responding because they see a change of leadership in Britain on the way? How can you deal with those kind of situations with a caretaker Prime Minister maybe for 2 months? Well, the Northern Ireland Protocol, if I remember correctly, Sam, you may correct me, didn't have any Conservative Member of Parliament vote against it. There was a large amount of support for it, and therefore I feel that the Prime Minister and the Cabinet have a mandate from the Conservative Party backbenchers to crack on with those issues. Jonathan Gullis, thank you very much indeed. Clearly, difficult day for Tory MPs, but there no regrets whatsoever from one person who has called for Boris Johnson to stand down.
Really interesting stuff there, Sam, and certainly from some of the people that Sam has been speaking to, and MPs more generally as well, it does feel as though not everyone is convinced that Boris Johnson has bought himself enough time to continue until the autumn. A couple of tweets I just want to bring you now from two people who we are potentially expecting to throw their hat into the ring for a leadership contest. Firstly, Tom Tugendhat saying it's the right call by Boris Johnson to resign. He delivered Brexit, rolled out the vaccine and led on Ukraine. Now we need a clean start. Well, let's contrast that to Liz Truss, shall we, the Foreign Secretary. The Prime Minister's made the right decision. She says the government under Boris's leadership had many achievements, delivering Brexit, vaccines and backing Ukraine. She then says we need calmness and unity now and to keep governing while a new leader is found. Well, let's bring in our political editor, Beth Rigby, shall we? And Beth, it does feel, doesn't it, like the starting gun has already been fired, the jostling has started.
Yeah, I mean, look, the starting gun was fired weeks ago, actually. This has been going on for weeks. MPs trying to corral support, taking soundings from backbenchers to see who might be in their camp. But now these leadership bids that we've all been talking about behind the scenes are going to come out into the open. And as you were saying there, Liz Truss, she will clearly try and run. Tom Tugendhat has been an adversary of Boris Johnson, and arguably many MPs would have said Tom Tugendhat was someone that should have been in government, if not even in cabinet. But he was never given a job by Boris Johnson, and he was consigned to the backbenches, where he became the chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, made a very powerful intervention during the evacuation of Kabul and Afghanistan. That was kind of the moment he kind of hit the consciousness, really, in this very powerful statement he made in the Commons. And he is the guy that the One Nation group of Tories, the people that would say they're sort of liberal conservative to the left of the party, they are, I think, he's the guy that would like to be their candidate. So we've got Liz Truss, Tom Tugendhat, Suella Braverman's already said she wants to, Sajid Javid almost certainly will, Rishi Sunak, and Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, who has long been a supporter of I'm trying to get this up for you, has long been a key supporter of Boris Johnson. He actually, according to some YouGov polling that, I'm just trying to find it on my phone, I can't find it. It's some YouGov polling out earlier today. It was only of 716 Conservative Party members, but he was the favourite. And then there would, from their point of view, he was the favourite, followed by Sunak, and in a runoff between them, this is 716 members, but if you extrapolate it out, Ben Wallace was going to be crowned the next leader. So we've got a series of runners and riders now.
It feels like their reaction to what's happened with Boris Johnson is going to be potentially critical. Those who have been loyal, like Ben Wallace, as you said, who haven't resigned, a long-standing ally, or the more critical people, such as Sajid Javid, who, of course, was the first one out of the blocks to quit. I guess it'll be interesting to see who ends up being rewarded for the different strategies.
Rewarded by whom?
In the leadership contest to go.
By the party?
Yeah, by the other MPs. Okay. And potentially by, if they make the runoff as well, by the members
Well, I
too.
guess, look, in terms of who gets rewarded or punished, I mean, Boris Johnson doesn't really have much support on the backbenchers, so I'm not sure that that's going to be a particular consideration for MPs. What they will be looking at is what's the base and what can they do. I mean, it is true that one former senior cabinet minister said to me a couple of days ago that he thought Nadine Zahawi, the door's open now, Nadine Zahawi was finished for standing on. There's James Doddridge. Are you disappointed to see him go, James Doddridge?
Of course, gave that very supportive interview, didn't he, yesterday?
Must have been it's a rough day for him. James Doddridge is the Prime Minister's ministerial aide, so he's the guy that is the eyes and ears for the Prime Minister in the Commons, and he must have had a really tough 24 hours. But yeah, going back to MPs, I mean, different people took different decisions. So Liz Truss decided to remain outwardly loyal while she was frenetically behind the scenes trying to get support. Sajid Javid thought his best bet would be to show leadership and integrity. And he got kind of out of the blocks by being in the Commons yesterday and being able to make that resignation speech, but also have his moment in the Sun where the public got to hear, and party members, his backstory and his kind of pitch for the leadership. I am a man of integrity. I didn't get into politics to be somebody. I came into politics to do something. So they'll all be now getting soundings from MPs, working out what their support base is, and I imagine very soon we will see those bids come out. It's been interesting today because, you know, we're obviously talking to people to see if they might come on camera and will they make a statement. And I think maybe today a number of people will think this is the moment of Boris Johnson's resignation. They don't want to be seen to be too eager, to be dancing on his grave. It's a bad analogy, but you know what I mean. So they might just hold off. But don't make no mistake, the soundings will be taken. Liz Truss is flying back right now. She's on the plane flying back because she needs to get back here.
I guess it's the balance, isn't it, between not wanting to, as you put it, dance on his grave, but also not being too slow to be behind the pack. Right. Exactly. Thank you so much for the analysis, Beth Rigby. You are, of course, watching Sky. We have just heard from the Prime Minister giving his resignation statement here in Downing Street. More to come. Good afternoon. You are watching Sky News at 1. We're live from Downing Street. Boris Johnson resigns as Prime Minister, saying it was painful not to be able to see out his term.
I want you to know how sad I am to be giving up the best job in the world. But them's the breaks.
His wife Carrie, carrying their baby, stood watching as he said that in politics, no one is remotely indispensable. Mr Johnson promised that government would carry on and he would continue as Prime Minister until a new leader is elected. Good afternoon. This is Sky News at 1. We are live in Downing Street, where Boris Johnson has just resigned, telling the country he finds it painful not to see his term through. Well, after an unprecedented 48-hour power struggle with his own MPs, the Prime Minister walked out of that door behind me, saying he fought so long to stay at number 10 because, in his words, it was his job, his duty and his obligation. But, in his own words, also an admission that no one in politics is remotely indispensable. Well, let's now listen to his statement in full.
It is clearly now the will of the Parliamentary Conservative Party that there should be a new leader of that party and therefore a new Prime Minister. And I've agreed with Sir Graham Brady, the chairman of our backbench MPs, that the process of choosing that new leader should begin now. And the timetable will be announced next week. And I've today appointed a cabinet to serve, as I will, until a new leader is in place. So I want to say to the millions of people who voted for us in 2019, many of them voting Conservative for the first time, thank you for that incredible mandate, the biggest Conservative majority since 1987, the biggest share of the vote since 1979. And the reason I have fought so hard in the last few days to continue to deliver that mandate in person was not just because I wanted to do so, but because I felt it was my job, my duty, my obligation to you to continue to do what we promised in 2019. And of course, I'm immensely proud of the achievements of this government, from getting Brexit done to settling our relations with the continent for over half a century, reclaiming the power for this country to make its own laws in Parliament, getting us all through the pandemic, delivering the fastest vaccine rollout in Europe, the fastest exit from lockdown, and in the last few months, leading the West in standing up to Putin's aggression in Ukraine. And let me say now to the people of Ukraine that I know that we in the UK will continue to back your fight for freedom for as long as it takes. And at the same time, in this country, we've been pushing forward a vast programme of investment in infrastructure and skills and technology, the biggest in a century, because if I have one insight into human beings, it is that genius and talent and enthusiasm and imagination are evenly distributed throughout the population, but opportunity is not. And that's why we must keep levelling up, keep unleashing the potential of every part of the United Kingdom. And if we can do that in this country, we will be the most prosperous in Europe. And in the last few days, I've tried to persuade my colleagues that it would be eccentric to change governments when we're delivering so much, and when we have such a vast mandate, and when we're actually only a handful of points behind in the polls, even in mid-term after quite a few months of pretty relentless sledging, and when the economic scene is so difficult domestically and internationally. And I regret not to have been successful in those arguments, and of course it's painful not to be able to see through so many ideas and projects myself. But as we've seen at Westminster, the herd instinct is powerful. When the herd moves, it moves. And my friends, in politics, no one is remotely indispensable. And our brilliant and Darwinian system will produce another leader equally committed to taking this country forward through tough times, not just helping families to get through it, but changing and improving the way we do things, cutting burdens on businesses and families, and yes, cutting taxes, because that is the way to generate the growth and the income we need to pay for great public services. And to that new leader, I say, whoever he or she may be, I say I will give you as much support as I can. And to you, the British public, I know that there will be many people who are relieved, and perhaps quite a few who will also be disappointed. And I want you to know how sad I am to be giving up the best job in the world. But them's the breaks. I want to thank Carrie and our children and all the members of my family who have had to put up with so much for so long. I want to thank the peerless British Civil Service for all the help and support that you have given our police, our emergency services, and of course our fantastic NHS, who at critical moment helped to extend my own period in office, as well as our armed services and our agencies that are so admired around the world, and our indefatigable Conservative Party members and supporters, whose selfless campaigning makes our democracy possible. I want to thank the wonderful staff here at Chequers, here at Number 10, and of course at Chequers, and our fantastic prop force detectives, the one group, by the way, who never leak. Above all, I want to thank you, the British public, for the immense privilege that you have given me. And I want you to know that from now on until the new Prime Minister is in place, your interests will be served and the government of the country will be carried on. Being Prime Minister is an education in itself. I've travelled to every part of the United Kingdom, and in addition to the beauty of our natural world, I found so many people possessed of such boundless British originality and so willing to tackle old problems in new ways that I know that even if things can sometimes seem dark now, our future together is golden. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Well, that was Boris Johnson's speech in Downing Street. It was listened to there, you can see, by a crowd, including his wife, Carrie Johnson, and their 9-month-old baby. She was standing next to Nadine Dorries, the Culture Secretary, a long-standing friend and ally of the Prime Minister. Just behind them, you can see to the Chief Whip, Chris Heaton-Harris, someone who's had an extremely fraught few days. But there you can see Carrie Johnson looking on as Boris Johnson, her husband, gave his resignation speech. No sign of their toddler, perhaps understandably, if anyone with small children will know. At the other end of Downing Street, there were very different scenes. If we can have a quick look there, you can see people crowding around, trying to capture a moment of history on their mobile phones. people smiling. We don't know if there were supporters of the Prime Minister or perhaps people who were glad to see. Well, these guys there chanting out, out, out. I think no question where their politics were, but certainly a crowded entry to Downing Street there as people came to watch Boris Johnson give that historic speech. Well, we can bring in our political editor, Beth Rigby, who's been with us here throughout the morning. Beth, it was quite a defiant speech from the Prime Minister as well, wasn't it? Going through his greatest achievements and clearly as well this morning, making those final appointments to his cabinet too.
Yeah, look, I think I'm just going back through what he said. And as I said earlier, it was vintage Boris Johnson. He put on his best show today, but he also made clear in that speech that he wasn't a reluctant resigner. Sorry, he was a reluctant resigner. He started off by saying thank you for the incredible mandate, the biggest Conservative majority since 1987. And he said, the reason I fought so hard in the last few days to continue to deliver that mandate in person was not just because I wanted to do so, because I felt it was my job, my duty, my obligation to you to continue to do what we promised in 2019. So Prime Minister forced out, but clearly thinking he still had the mandate from the public. And he, of his decision, said it's clearly now the will of the Parliamentary Conservative Party that there should be a new leader and therefore a new Prime Minister. He then went on to say, and this was one of the, he has a brilliant way with words, Boris Johnson. He was a columnist. I mean, lots of his words, I should also have been very controversial, and he has been held to account for some of the phrases he's used, but in this instance, he used this phrase. He said, herd instinct is powerful, and when the herd moves, it moves. And it did move, didn't it? It moved with ferocious pace, a stampede of resignations from Tuesday night into Wednesday morning, with now 59 resignations from government. And then he said, no one in politics is no one is remotely dispensable. He also said, and again a message to the Parliamentary Party, that he wasn't really doing as bad as perhaps they thought, pointing out that the Tories were only a handful of points behind in the polls even in mid-term. I mean, I'd seen them in double-digit points division, so a handful of points, that might be a bit contested. But he said after quite a few months with pretty relentless sledging, that's not bad going when the economic scene is so difficult domestically and internationally. So he very clear there that maybe things from his perspective were not as bad as perhaps some of his cabinet and party would have thought. But he said, and this one really stood out for me, I want you to know how sad I am to be giving up the best job in the world, but them's the breaks. And he said, he then ended, didn't he, by thanking the British public for the privilege of having the job. And he said, even in these dark days, our future remains golden. So a flick of Boris boosterism and optimism at the end, and then rapturous applause from the MPs that had come to watch the speech. And as you said, behind us there, outside number 11, all of his staff, and Carrie Johnson, his wife, and his baby, Romy, and their little son, Wilf, not there. But as you said, and we both know because we've both got kids, you don't bring toddlers out to official occasions like this.
It feels like that was a very legitimate and sensible decision indeed. The kind of newborn in the sling is one thing, or the 9-month-old, I should say, in the sling is one thing. Beth, thank you very much for your analysis. As always, Beth Rigby, political editor there. She was talking about the rapturous applause in the streets from Boris Johnson's allies, who were his staff, but also the friendly MPs who came to watch too. I guess the question now is, what will the reception be among the wider parliamentary party? The vast majority of whom did not come to the streets in Downing Street. Will they accept his desire to stay on as leader until the autumn? Will they try and push him out? It feels like these questions still to be answered. Now, despite his resignation, Boris Johnson has still been making appointments to his cabinet this morning to try and fill the posts that have been left vacant by all those resignations. So let's have a little run through, shall we? Number 10 announced that Greg Clark has been appointed as Secretary of State for Levelling Up, Housing and Communities. Now that is the role that Michael Gove was sacked from last night. James Cleverly has been appointed as the new Secretary of State for Education, the role that became available after Michelle Donnellan quit